Welcome to Lost Scrolls Archive deep beneath the scorching sands of Saqqara, in a burial chamber that had remained sealed for over 4 millennia. French archaeologist Gaston Maspero made a discovery in 1881 that would revolutionize understanding of ancient Egyptian religious thought. As his torch illuminated the inner walls of the Pyramid of Unas, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, he found himself staring at columns upon columns of hieroglyphic inscriptions covering every available surface. These were not decorative motifs or historical accounts, but something far more extraordinary. The oldest religious texts known to humanity, carved directly into the stone walls of the pharaoh's eternal resting place. The Pyramid of Unas, constructed around 2375 to 2345 BC, marked a pivotal moment in Egyptian civilization when the spoken word became permanently etched in stone. For centuries prior, the elaborate rituals and magical formulas that guided pharaohs through death had existed only in the memories of priests and the ephemeral papyri that disintegrated with time. But Unas changed everything. His pyramid walls bore witness to 283 distinct spells, set, each one meticulously carved by skilled artisans who understood they were creating something sacred, a permanent magical arsenal that would serve their divine king throughout eternity. These pyramid texts, as scholars would later name them, represented the crystallization of beliefs that had been developing since the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. The spells themselves spoke of concepts and deities whose origins stretched back to pre-dynastic times, when scattered tribes along the Nile first began to contemplate what lay beyond death. Yet it was only in the Pyramid of Unas that these ancient traditions found their definitive expression, transforming from oral tradition into immutable stone scripture. The exclusivity of these texts cannot be overstated. In the rigidly hierarchical society of Old Kingdom Egypt, access to the afterlife's most powerful magic remained the absolute privilege of divinity incarnate, the pharaoh himself. Common people, even high-ranking nobles, possess no such elaborate textual protection for their journey beyond death. Their mummified remains lay in simple mustaba tombs, accompanied perhaps by basic grave goods and rudimentary protective amulets, but nothing approaching the comprehensive magical shield that surrounded their divine ruler. This royal monopoly on death magic reflected fundamental Egyptian theological principles. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, but the living embodiment of the god Horus, the earthly representative of divine order, who maintained cosmic balance between the forces of chaos and creation. His death represented a cosmic crisis that required extraordinary magical intervention to resolve. The pyramid texts served as both insurance policy and instruction manual, ensuring that the pharaoh's divine essence would successfully navigate the treacherous passages of the underworld and emerge triumphant as a transfigured spirit. Within the confines of Unu's burial chamber, these spells created a three-dimensional magical environment. The hieroglyphs were not merely written, but strategically positioned to maximize their protective power. Certain spells appeared near the sarcophagus, others along the walls leading to the burial chamber, and still others in the antechamber, where the pharaoh's body would first rest before its final journey. Each placement had significance, creating invisible barriers against the demons and hostile forces that threatened to devour the royal soul. The texts themselves revealed a complex understanding of death as transformation rather than termination. They spoke of the pharaoh's body as a temporary vessel that would be discarded like old clothing, while his divine essence, his Ka, Ba, and Akh, would undergo a series of metamorphoses. The deceased king would first become one with the imperishable stars, then merge with the solar deity Red during his daily journey across the sky, and finally achieve identification with Osiris, the lord of the underworld. This triple transformation required different magical formulas at each stage, explaining the vast number and variety of spells inscribed within the pyramid walls. The theological framework underlying these texts centered on two interconnected mythological cycles that would dominate Egyptian religious thought for the next 3,000 years. The first involved Re, the sun god, whose daily journey across the heavens provided the fundamental metaphor for death and rebirth. Each dawn re-emerged from the eastern horizon in his solar bark, traveled across the sky during the day, and descended into the underworld at sunset. There he would battle the serpent, Apus, and other forces of chaos, before emerging victorious at dawn to begin the cycle anew. The pharaoh's afterlife journey mirrored this solar cycle in intricate detail. Pyramid tech spells described how the deceased king would join his crew aboard the solar bark, participating in the nightly battle against chaos and sharing in the sun, God's daily resurrection. The texts provided specific incantations for each phase of this journey, formulas to ensure the pharaoh's acceptance aboard the divine vessel, spells to protect him during the dangerous passage through the underworld, and magical words that would guarantee his emergence into the light of a new day. Parallel to the solar mythology ran the equally important cycle of Osiris, the god who had once ruled Egypt as a benevolent king before being murdered by his jealous brother Seth. According to the myth, Osiris's wife Isis gathered his scattered remains and through powerful magic restored him to life long enough to conceive their son, Horus. Though Osiris could not return to the land of the living, he became ruler of the dead, offering the promise of resurrection to all who followed his example. The pyramid texts work together with these two mythological frameworks with remarkable sophistication. The pharaoh would simultaneously be read during the day and Osiris during the night, participating in the solar journey while also ruling over the realm of the dead. This dual identification required careful magical preparation, and the texts provided detailed instructions for achieving both transformations. Spells described how the pharaoh would become Re when he rises in the eastern horizon and become Osiris when he sets in the western horizon, creating a perpetual cycle of divine manifestation. The language of these early texts possessed a raw power that later Egyptian religious literature would rarely match. The spells spoke with absolute authority, commanding rather than requesting divine assistance. One text declared, "The sky trembles, the earth quakes before the pharaoh when he ascends to the sky. He is the god who lives on his fathers and feeds on his mothers." Another proclaimed, "The pharaoh's terror is before the gods like the terror of the night sky before the earth." These were not humble prayers, but magical formulas that compelled the very fabric of reality to bend to the pharaoh's will. The hieroglyphic script itself became a vehicle for magical transformation within the pyramid walls. Certain dangerous symbols, images of snakes, crocodiles, or other threatening creatures were deliberately mutilated or depicted incompletely to prevent them from causing harm to the deceased pharaoh. In some cases, scribes would carve only the front half of the dangerous animal or pierce it with knives or show it bound with ropes. This practice, known as execration, demonstrated the Egyptians' belief that written words and images possessed independent power that required careful control. The physical act of carving these texts into stone represented a monumental undertaking that required years of planning and execution. Teams of skilled artisans work by lamplight in the narrow confines of the pyramid's interior chambers, carefully transferring the sacred formulas from papyrus templates onto the limestone walls. Each hieroglyph had to be perfect, as a single error could compromise the spell's effectiveness and endanger the pharaoh's eternal welfare. The precision of their work, still visible today after more than 4 millennia, testifies to the extraordinary care taken in creating these magical protections. The success of Unu's pyramid inspired his successors to adopt and expand upon his innovations. The pyramids of Teti, Pepe I, Mornra, and Pepe II all contained their own versions of the pyramid texts, with each pharaoh's scribes adding new spells while preserving the essential core of protective formulas. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the corpus had grown to include over 700 distinct spells, creating the most comprehensive magical library the ancient world had ever seen. Yet, even as these texts reached their fullest expression in royal pyramids, forces were already at work that would eventually break the pharaoh's monopoly on death magic. The political upheavals of the first intermediate period weakened royal authority and allowed provincial nobles to claim privileges once reserved for divinity alone. Gradually, the exclusive spells that had protected pharaohs began appearing in the tombs of high officials, marking the first step in what would become a complete democratization of Egyptian death magic. The transformation from royal exclusivity to broader accessibility would unfold over centuries, but its roots lay in the very success of the pyramid texts themselves. By proving that written magic could indeed provide protection in the afterlife, these early inscriptions created a demand that would eventually extend far beyond the narrow confines of royal burial chambers. The collapse of the Old Kingdom, around 2181 BC, shattered more than just political authority. It fractured the very foundations of Egyptian religious orthodoxy. As the Great Pyramids of Giza stood silent, the royal occupants unable to maintain the cosmic order they had once guaranteed, a profound transformation began rippling through Egyptian society. The chaos of the First Intermediate Period, with its warring dynasties and provincial uprisings, created cracks in the rigid theological hierarchy that had kept death magic locked within royal burial chambers for over 5 centuries. When Mentuhotep II finally reunited Egypt around 2055 BC, establishing the Middle Kingdom from his capital at Thebes, the world he inherited bore little resemblance to the pharaoh-centered cosmos of the pyramid builders. Provincial nobles, who had carved out independent fiefdoms during their anarchic decades, possessed wealth, power, and most importantly, aspirations that could no longer be contained by traditional boundaries. These men had witnessed the failure of divine kingship firsthand. They had seen pharaohs die ignominiously, their pyramids looted, their mummies desecrated. If the gods could not protect their earthly representatives, then perhaps mortals needed to secure their own passage to eternity. The revolution began quietly in the rock-cut tombs of Middle Egypt, where ambitious governors and wealthy officials started commissioning administrative equipment that would have scandalized their old kingdom predecessors. Instead of simple wooden coffins decorated with basic protective symbols, these new sarcophagi blazed with hieroglyphic inscriptions that borrow directly from the sacred pyramid texts. The spells that had once protected Pharaoh Unas now adorned the coffin of a provincial mayor. Formulas that had guided Pharaoh Pepe through the underworld now served a wealthy merchant's eternal journey. The earliest examples of these coffin texts appeared around 2055 BC in the necropolises of Saqqara and Ashur, but their true flowering occurred in the cemeteries of Middle Egypt, particularly at sites like Beni, Hassan, Dil Bura, and Mia. Here, local officials who had accumulated vast fortunes during the political upheavals commissioned elaborate wooden coffins that transformed the deceased sarcophagus into a portable pyramid chamber. Every available surface, the floor, walls, ceiling, and even the interior of the lid, became a canvas for magical protection. The scribes responsible for these inscriptions faced an unprecedented challenge. The pyramid texts had been composed specifically for divine pharaohs, with spells that assumed the deceased possessed inherent godhood and automatic acceptance among the celestial powers. Adapting these formulas for mortal nobles required sophisticated theological innovation. The solution they developed involved creating personalized versions of royal spells, substituting the coffin owner's name for the pharaoh's, while adding new incantations specifically designed for non-royal afterlife navigation. This democratization process produced remarkable textual variations. A spell that originally proclaimed the pharaohs, the god who lives on his fathers, might be modified to read Keti is the god who lives on his fathers, transforming a provincial administrator into a divine being through the power of written magic. More significantly, entirely new categories of spells emerged to address the unique challenges faced by non-royal souls in the afterlife. These included formulas for gaining admission to divine councils, incantations for acquiring the food and drink necessary for eternal sustenance, and protective spells against demons who might challenge a mortal's right to immortality. The geographical expansion of death magic coincided with increasingly sophisticated mapping of the afterlife landscape itself. While the pyramid texts had provided general descriptions of the celestial realm, the coffin texts offered detailed topographical surveys that read like ancient travel guides. The most significant of these innovations involved elaborate descriptions of the fields of reeds, known Egyptian as Sit Aru, which represented the agricultural paradise where blessed souls would spend eternity. Earlier texts had mentioned the fields of reeds only in passing, describing them as a place where the deceased would plow the fields and reap the harvest. The coffin texts transformed this vague reference into a comprehensive geographical description that included precise measurements, navigational landmarks, and detailed instructions for agricultural work in the afterlife. According to these new texts, the fields of reeds measured exactly 1,000 by 1,000 cubits and were divided into distinct regions, each with its own characteristics and requirements. The eastern section of the fields contained barley that grew to a height of 4 cubits, while the western portion produced emmer wheat reaching 7 cubits in height. Between these agricultural zones flowed canals, whose waters never failed, fed by the celestial Nile that connected the earthly river to its divine source. The texts provided specific sailing directions for navigating these waterways, including the names of ferrymen who controlled passage between different regions and the exact words required to secure their cooperation. These geographical innovations reflected a fundamental shift in Egyptian afterlife theology. Where the pyramid texts had emphasized the pharaoh's transformation into stellar and solar deities, the coffin texts focused increasingly on the practical requirements of eternal existence. The deceased noble needed to know not just how to become a god, but how to function as an immortal being in a landscape that combined familiar earthly elements with supernatural enhancements. The barley and wheat of the fields of reeds resembled crops from the Nile Valley, but their extraordinary heights symbolized the abundance that awaited those who successfully navigated the afterlife's challenges. The coffin texts also introduced revolutionary concepts of moral judgment that would later become central to Egyptian religious thought. While the pyramid texts had assumed the pharaoh's automatic righteousness based on his divine nature, the democratization of death magic required new mechanisms for determining worthiness among mortal souls. The solution emerged in the form of declarations of innocence that scholars would later term the negative confession. These early confessional formulas appeared scattered throughout various coffin text spells, requiring the deceased to deny specific transgressions before divine tribunals. A typical declaration might read, "I have not committed evil against men. I have not mistreated animals. I have not committed sins in the place of truth. I have not known what should not be known." The deceased would recite these denials while standing before assemblies of gods who possess the power to grant or deny access to the afterlife's rewards. The moral framework underlying these confessions reflected Middle Kingdom social values with remarkable precision. The prohibited actions included not just major crimes like murder and theft, but subtle social transgressions that revealed Egyptian concerns about proper behavior within their hierarchical society. The deceased had to deny gossiping about superiors, showing disrespect to parents, cheating in business transactions, or displaying arrogance towards social inferiors. These requirements suggested that moral worthiness involved maintaining social harmony rather than adhering to abstract ethical principles. The implementation of moral judgment created new dramatic possibilities for afterlife narratives. The coffin texts described elaborate courtroom scenes where the deceased would face interrogation by divine judges who possessed supernatural knowledge of every action performed during earthly life. The god Thoth would read from scrolls containing complete records of the soul's deeds, while other deities weighed testimony and rendered verdicts. These judicial proceedings could result in various outcomes: complete vindication and admission to the fields of reeds, partial punishment followed by rehabilitation, or total destruction for the irredeemably wicked. The artistic innovations accompanying these textual developments transformed Egyptian coffin decoration from simple protective symbolism into complex narrative programs. Middle Kingdom sarcophagi became three-dimensional books that guided their occupants through every stage of afterlife transformation. The coffin floor typically displayed maps of the underworld, with labeled pathways and landmarks, while the walls contained spells organized according to the sequence in which they would be needed during the posthumous journey. The interior lid often featured astronomical diagrams showing the deceased destination among the imperishable stars, complete with constellation maps and celestial information for timing various transformations. Side panels might display scenes of agricultural work in the fields of reeds, giving the coffin owner visual previews of their eternal activities. These decorative programs required unprecedented collaboration between scribes, artists, and theologians, who worked together to create coherent magical environments within the confined space of a wooden sarcophagus. The personalization of death magic reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the tombs of the wealthiest nobles. Individual coffins might contain unique spells composed specifically for their owners, incorporating personal names, family relationships, and professional accomplishments into traditional magical formulas. A military commander might receive specialized protection against the demons of battlefield death, while a priest could access exclusive spells for maintaining divine favor in the afterlife. These customizations required scribes to possess not just technical writing skills, but deep theological knowledge and creative adaptation abilities. The workshop production of coffin texts created new economic opportunities throughout Middle Egypt. Specialized scriptoriums emerged in major cemetery towns, employing teams of scribes who could rapidly produce personalized magical texts for wealthy clients. These establishments maintained libraries of template spells that could be modified according to customer specifications, while also developing new formulas to address emerging theological concerns. The most successful workshops attracted clients from distant provinces, creating the first commercial market for standardized religious texts in Egyptian history. The technical challenges of inscribing lengthy texts inside coffins pushed Egyptian woodworking and writing techniques to new levels of refinement. Scribes developed specialized tools for working in the cramped confines of sarcophagi, including curved brushes for painting around corners and miniaturized palettes for mixing pigments in small quantities. The hieroglyphic script itself evolved to accommodate space constraints with certain signs, abbreviated or combined in ways that would have been unacceptable in monumental inscriptions, but served perfectly for coffin texts. Quality control became a significant concern as the coffin text industry expanded. Wealthy patrons demanded accuracy in their magical protection, leading to the development of proofreading procedures that involved multiple scribes checking each other's work. Errors in magical texts could have catastrophic consequences for the deceased. So, workshops implemented rigorous quality assurance protocols. Master scribes would review completed coffins line by line, comparing them against authoritative templates and correcting any mistakes before final delivery. The geographical distribution of coffin texts reveals the political and economic networks that connected Middle Kingdom Egypt. While the greatest concentrations appeared in the cemeteries of Middle Egypt, examples have been discovered from the Delta to the First Cataract, suggesting that the technology spread rapidly throughout the reunified kingdom. Regional variations in spell selection and artistic style provide insights into local theological preferences and cultural traditions that persisted despite political unification. The influence of coffin texts extended beyond their immediate function to reshape Egyptian religious literature more broadly. Scribes working on these projects developed new compositional techniques that would later appear in temple inscriptions, raw monuments, and literary works. The practice of adapting ancient texts for contemporary use became a standard feature of Egyptian religious culture, establishing precedents that would influence textual transmission for the remainder of Pharaonic history. As the coffin-bound nobles of the Middle Kingdom lay surrounded by their protective texts, few could have anticipated that their exclusive magical privileges would soon face the same democratizing forces that had earlier liberated death magic from royal pyramids. The second intermediate period brought fresh chaos to Egypt with Hyksos rulers, controlling the north while Theban princes maintained precarious independence in the south. Yet from this political fragmentation emerged innovations that would revolutionize how Egyptians approached death preparation, transforming the cumbersome coffin inscriptions into portable, affordable, and infinitely reproducible magical protection. The catalyst for this transformation came around 1550 BC, when Amos first expelled the Hyksos and established the 18th dynasty, ushering in the New Kingdom period that would witness Egypt's greatest territorial expansion and cultural flowering. The military campaigns that carried Egyptian armies into Nubia, the Levant, and beyond brought unprecedented wealth flowing into the Nile Valley, creating a prosperous middle class of administrators, artisans, merchants, and military officers who possessed both the resources and the aspiration to secure their own afterlife insurance. The technical breakthrough that made mass production of death magic possible involved the systematic adoption of papyrus scrolls as the primary medium for orary texts. While papyrus had been used for administrative and literary purposes since the Old Kingdom, its application to magical protection required solving significant preservation challenges. Coffin texts carved in wood could theoretically last forever if properly maintained, but papyrus scrolls buried in tomb conditions faced threats from moisture, insects, and simple deterioration that could render their magical contents useless precisely when they were needed most. Egyptian scribes addressed these preservation concerns through innovations in papyrus preparation and magical enhancement. The finest scrolls destined for tomb use were manufactured from the highest quality, papyrus plants, with individual strips carefully selected for uniformity and strength. The manufacturing process involved extended soaking periods that removed all organic impurities, followed by pressing techniques that created exceptionally dense sheets resistant to moisture penetration. Multiple layers were then laminated together using specially prepared adhesives that included magical ingredients believed to enhance the scroll's supernatural durability. The writing materials applied to these premium scrolls represented another significant advancement. Traditional ink, made from carbon and gum, worked adequately for administrative documents, but lacked the permanence required for eternal magical protection. New Kingdom scribes developed enhanced ink formulations that incorporated powdered minerals, precious metals, and ritually consecrated organic compounds. Gold ink became particularly prized for the most important spells, as the incorruptible metal was believed to imbue the text with solar power that would remain effective throughout eternity. The transition from coffin walls to papyrus scrolls necessitated fundamental changes in how magical texts were organized and presented. Coffin texts had been arranged according to the physical constraints of wooden surfaces, with spells distributed across available spaces without necessarily following logical sequences. Papyrus scrolls offered unprecedented flexibility in textual organization, allowing scribes to arrange spells and coherent progressions that matched the deceased's anticipated journey through the afterlife. This organizational freedom led to the development of standardized spell collections that scholars would later designate as the Book of the Dead, though the ancient Egyptians themselves knew these texts by various names, including the Book of Coming Forth by Day and the chapters of Coming Forth by Day. The standardization process involves selecting the most effective spells from the vast corpus of coffin texts, while adding new formulas specifically designed for the changing religious landscape of the New Kingdom. The canonical collection that emerged from this editorial process contained approximately 190 to 200 distinct spells, each assigned a specific chapter number by modern scholars. However, individual scrolls rarely contained the complete collection, as customers typically selected particular combinations based on their personal needs, financial resources, and regional preferences. A basic scroll might include only the most essential spells for afterlife navigation, while wealthy patrons could commission comprehensive collections that included every available magical formula. The House of Life institutions, known in Egyptian as Per-Ankh, played crucial roles in standardizing and distributing these new papyrus collections. These ancient scriptoriums attached to major temples throughout Egypt functioned as combination libraries, schools, and publishing houses where master scribes trained apprentices while producing both religious and secular texts. The Per-Ankh at Memphis, Thebes, Hermopolis, and other major centers became specialized production facilities for papyri, developing distinctive regional styles and spell preferences that reflected local theological traditions. The Memphis House of Life, with its proximity to the ancient capital and the Great Pyramids, maintained particularly strong connections to Old Kingdom religious traditions. Scrolls produced there often emphasize solar theology and stellar transformation, incorporating spells that trace their origins back to the earliest pyramid texts. The scribes working in Memphis workshops prided themselves on preserving archaic spell versions that other centers had modernized, creating products that appealed to customers who valued traditional authenticity over contemporary innovations. In contrast, the Theban Perk reflected the political and religious prominence of the New Kingdom capital. Theban scrolls typically featured elaborate vignettes depicting the deceased before Osiris and other underworld deities, with particular emphasis on the judgment scene that had become central to New Kingdom afterlife beliefs. The artistic workshops attached to the Theban House of Life employed the finest painters in Egypt, creating illuminated manuscripts that rivaled royal tomb decorations in their sophistication and beauty. The Hermopolitan tradition represented yet another approach, emphasizing the intellectual and magical aspects of afterlife preparation over artistic display. Scrolls from the Hermopolis Per-Ankh contained extensive magical formulas with minimal illustration, appealing to customers who prioritized textual completeness over visual appeal. The scribes there developed reputation for scholarly accuracy and comprehensive spell collections that attracted clients from throughout Middle Egypt. The economic implications of papyrus production created entirely new industries throughout the Nile Valley. Papyrus cultivation, previously limited to meeting administrative needs, expanded dramatically to supply the grocery market. Specialized farms in the Delta marshlands employed thousands of workers who harvested, processed, and prepared the raw materials for scroll production. The quality grades developed for different market segments range from premium royal papyrus reserved for wealthiest customers to more affordable grades that made basic magical protection accessible to modest middle-class families. The scribble profession itself underwent significant transformation as demand for ceremonial texts expanded beyond the capacity of traditional temple scriptoriums. Independent workshops emerged in major cities, employing scribes who specialized exclusively in producing Book of the Dead scrolls for commercial sale. These entrepreneurs developed efficient production techniques that reduced costs while maintaining acceptable quality standards, creating the first mass market for religious texts in human history. The standardization process that created recognizable spell chapters involved extensive collaboration between scribes from different regions and institutions. Conferences held at major religious centers brought together master scribes who compared their local traditions and worked to establish authoritative versions of popular spells. These scholarly gatherings produced reference texts that served as models for scribes throughout Egypt, though regional variations continued to flourish alongside the emerging standards. Chapter numbering systems developed gradually as scribes recognized the need for consistent organizational frameworks. The most influential numbering scheme originated in Theban workshops during the reign of Thutmose, when master scribes created a comprehensive catalogue that assigned sequential numbers to spells based on their position in an idealized complete collection. This theme system spread throughout Egypt as scribes copied successful organizational models, though alternative numbering schemes persisted in some regions. The spell selection process for individual scrolls involved complex negotiations between customers and scribes that balanced magical effectiveness against practical constraints. Wealthy patrons might commission scrolls containing 150 or more chapters, creating comprehensive magical libraries that addressed every conceivable afterlife contingency. Middle-class customers typically selected 30 to 50 essential spells that provided basic protection while remaining affordable. Even modest families could afford abbreviated collections containing the most crucial formulas for successful afterlife navigation. The artistic enhancement of papyrus scrolls represented another significant innovation that distinguished New Kingdom products from their coffin text predecessors. While coffin inscriptions had been primarily textual with minimal illustration, papyrus scrolls incorporated elaborate vignettes that depicted key scenes from the deceased's anticipated afterlife journey. These illustrations served both decorative and magical functions, providing visual representations that reinforced the textual spells while offering additional layers of supernatural protection. The most sophisticated scrolls featured full-color illustrations painted by master artists who specialized in artistic iconography. These painters developed standardized visual vocabularies that depicted common afterlife scenes with remarkable consistency across different workshops and regions. The judgment scene before Osiris became particularly standardized, with established conventions for showing the weighing of the heart, the presence of various divine witnesses, and the potential outcomes of moral evaluation. The production timeline for high-quality scrolls could extend over several months as teams of specialists collaborated on different aspects of the project. Master scribes would first prepare the text, carefully copying selected spells in their finest hieroglyphic hands while leaving spaces for planned illustrations. Apprentice scribes might then add chapter titles and decorative elements under supervision, while specialized artists painted the vignettes according to customer specifications. Final quality control involved master scribes reviewing the completed scroll for accuracy and completeness before delivery to the customer. The regional variations that persisted despite standardization efforts reflected deeply rooted theological traditions that could not be easily harmonized. Northern Egyptian scrolls often emphasized different deities and magical formulas than their southern counterparts, reflecting the distinct religious traditions that had developed during periods of political fragmentation. These regional preferences created specialized markets for scrolls that catered to particular theological orientations, with customers traveling considerable distances to obtain products that match their specific religious backgrounds. The accessibility revolution created by papyrus production fundamentally altered Egyptian society's relationship with death and the afterlife. Where previous generations had accepted that elaborate magical protection remained the exclusive privilege of royalty and high nobility, New Kingdom Egyptians could realistically aspire to secure their own supernatural insurance through careful saving and planning. This democratization of death magic contributed to broader social changes that characterized the New Kingdom period, including increased social mobility and the emergence of a substantial middle class with unprecedented economic power. The workshop apprenticeship systems that developed around Book of the Dead production created new educational opportunities for young Egyptians who might otherwise have remained illiterate. Apprentice scribes learned not just writing techniques, but also theological knowledge, artistic skills, and business practices that prepared them for careers in the expanding religious text industry. The most talented apprentices could eventually establish their own workshops, creating entrepreneurial opportunities that contributed to Egypt's economic dynamism during the New Kingdom period. The proliferation of papyrus scrolls throughout New Kingdom Egypt carried within their hieroglyphic columns a transformation far more profound than mere technological advancement. As these portable magical texts spread from royal tombs to middle-class burial chambers, they brought with them an entirely new conception of death itself, not as an automatic transition for the divinely ordained, but as a moral reckoning where every soul, regardless of earthly status, would face judgment before the assembled powers of the universe. At the heart of this revolutionary theology stood a scene so central to Egyptian religious imagination that it appeared in virtually every book of the Dead Scroll: the weighing of the heart in the Hall of Two Truths. The Hall of Two Truths, known in Egyptian as the Hall of Mati, represented the cosmic courtroom where universal justice prevailed over earthly privilege and divine authority superseded human hierarchy. Unlike the chaotic demon-infested passages that characterize much of the Underworld journey, this sacred space embodied perfect order and absolute fairness. The hall itself stretched vast beyond mortal comprehension, its ceiling supported by pillars that reached towards infinity, while its floor remained solid as the primordial mound from which creation first emerged. Every surface gleamed with the pure light of truth that penetrated all deception and revealed the authentic nature of every soul that entered. The architectural symbolism of the hall reflected the fundamental duality that governed Egyptian cosmic thought. The two truths, referenced in its name, represented the complementary principles of justice and righteousness that maintained universal order: matter's cosmic law and matter's ethical behavior, divine decree and mortal responsibility, celestial perfection and earthly striving. The hall's design incorporated this duality through its division into two identical sections, each presided over by a goddess Mat, wearing her characteristic ostrich feather, the ultimate symbol of truth's perfect balance. Within this awesome space, the deceased would encounter the most terrifying and magnificent assembly of divine beings ever conceived by human imagination. 42 judges, each representing a different nome or administrative district of Egypt, sat in solemn tribunal along the hall's perimeter. These were not merely local deities elevated to cosmic significance, but primordial powers whose authority predated human civilization itself. Each judge bore responsibility for evaluating specific categories of moral behavior, from the obvious crimes of murder and theft to subtle transgressions involving proper respect for parents, honest dealing in business transactions, and appropriate humility before social superiors. The identities of these divine judges reflected the comprehensive nature of Egyptian moral philosophy. He who lives on blood evaluated acts of violence and cruelty, while Bone Crusher judged those who had destroyed others through false testimony or malicious gossip. Eater of Entrails examined sexual transgressions and violations of ritual purity, while Lord of Truth assessed the deceased overall commitment to honesty and justice throughout their earthly existence. Each judge possessed intimate knowledge of every action performed by the soul standing before them, having observed human behavior from their celestial vantage points throughout the deceased's lifetime. The physical appearance of these judges combined human and animal characteristics in ways designed to emphasize their supernatural authority and terrifying power. Some appeared as men with the heads of crocodiles, their massive jaws capable of crushing any soul found wanting in moral worthiness. Others manifested as women with serpent heads, the hypnotic gaze penetrating every deception and revealing hidden guilt. Still others combined multiple animal forms, the strength of lions, the keen sight of hawks, the patient wisdom of ibises, creating composite beings whose very presence reminded the deceased of their complete vulnerability before divine justice. At the center of this divine assembly stood the most crucial figure in the entire judgment process: Anubis, the jackal-headed god, whose mastery of mummification and intimate knowledge of death qualified him uniquely to oversee the weighing of hearts. Anubis appeared in his most magnificent form, his black fur gleaming with supernatural luster, while his alert ears remained constantly attuned to the slightest sound that might indicate deceptional fear in the soul before him. His hands, combining human dexterity with divine precision, manipulated the great balance scales that would determine the deceased's eternal fate. The scales themselves represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of cosmic technology ever imagined by Egyptian theologians. Constructed from materials that existed beyond the physical realm, gold that never tarnished, silver that reflected absolute truth, bronze that resonated with perfect harmony. These balances possessed sensitivity that could detect the weight of a single thought or the mass of an unspoken intention. The crossbeams stretched exactly the length required to maintain perfect equilibrium, while the supporting post extended deep into the foundation of creation itself, ensuring that no earthly force could disturb the accuracy of the weighing process. The weighing procedure followed a precise ritual sequence that had been established since the first soul-face judgment in the primordial age. Anubis would first examine the heart that had been carefully preserved within the deceased mummified body, checking for signs of corruption or decay that might indicate moral failure during earthly life. The heart itself appeared, not as the physical organ removed during mummification, but as the spiritual essence that contained every memory, emotion, and moral choice made throughout the deceased's existence. This spiritual heart bore the accumulated weight of every action performed during life, with virtuous deeds creating lightness that would aid in the weighing process, while sins added density that could doom the soul to destruction. The Egyptian conception of moral weight operated according to principles that modern minds might find counterintuitive. Pride and arrogance added crushing heaviness to the heart, while humility and compassion created an almost ethereal lightness. Greed accumulated like lead within the spiritual organ, while generosity produced a golden radiance that seemed to defy gravity itself. The feather of my hat, placed on the opposite side of the scales, represented the perfect standard against which all mortal behavior would be measured. This was not an ordinary feather plucked from some earthly bird, but the primordial feather of truth that had existed since the moment of creation, when the first word of divine command brought order from chaos. Its perfect symmetry reflected the ideal balance that should govern all existence, while its weightlessness demonstrated the ease with which truth could overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. The feather's appearance varied according to different textual traditions, but most descriptions emphasized its pristine white color that remained unmarked by any shadow or stain. Some texts described it as emanating its own light, creating a soft radiance that illuminated the entire weighing process while revealing every detail of the heart's moral condition. Others portrayed it as completely transparent, allowing observers to see through its substance while still recognizing its undeniable presence and authority. As Anubis carefully placed the heart on one side of the scales and the feather on the other, the entire assembly of divine judges leaned forward in anticipation. This moment represented the culmination of the deceased's entire existence, when every choice made during earthly life would receive its ultimate evaluation. The scales themselves seemed to vibrate with cosmic energy as they sought their equilibrium, the crossbeam oscillating back and forth, while the universe itself held its breath. The possible outcomes of this weighing process created dramatic tension that permeated every aspect of the judgment scene. If the heart balanced perfectly against the feather, demonstrating that the deceased had lived according to the principles of Mat, the soul would be declared justified or true of voice and granted immediate admission to the blessed afterlife. Such souls would undergo transformation into AKH, effective spirits who possessed the knowledge and power necessary to function among the gods themselves. However, if the heart proved heavier than the feather, weighed down by accumulated sins and moral failures, the consequences would be swift and terrifying. In such cases, the scales would tip decisively toward the heart's side, creating an imbalance that triggered the most feared punishment in Egyptian religious imagination. Complete and utter annihilation at the jaws of Ammit, the devourer of the dead. Ammit represented the ultimate nightmare of Egyptian afterlife theology. Not mere death, which could be overcome through proper magical preparation, but absolute non-existence that eliminated any possibility of resurrection or continued consciousness. Her composite form combined the most terrifying aspects of three predatory animals: the head of a crocodile with its bone-crushing jaws and insatiable appetite, the torso and arms of a lion with its predatory strength and relentless hunting instinct, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus with its unpredictable violence and territorial aggression. The artistic depictions of Ammit that appeared in Book of the Dead vignettes emphasized her monstrous nature through carefully chosen details that maximized her terrifying impact. Her crocodile head featured rows of razor-sharp teeth that could shred both flesh and spirit, while her eyes burned with supernatural hunger that had remained unsatisfied since the beginning of time. Her lion's body rippled with muscles that possessed strength beyond physical measurement, capable of restraining even the most powerful souls, while her hippopotamus hindquarters provided the stability necessary to devour her victims completely. Ammit's position within the Hall of Two Truths reflected her unique role as cosmic executioner. She crouched beside the scales in patient readiness, her predatory gaze fixed upon every heart that underwent weighing, while her massive jaws remained slightly parted in anticipation of feeding. Unlike the divine judges who evaluated moral behavior according to established principles, Ammit operated according to pure instinct, responding automatically to the scale's verdict, without mercy or hesitation. The consumption process that Ammit performed upon condemned souls represented the most complete destruction imaginable within Egyptian theological frameworks. She would devour not just the heart that had failed the weighing test, but every aspect of the deceased spiritual existence, their ka, ba, shadow, and name. This total consumption eliminated all traces of the soul's existence, preventing any possibility of resurrection, reincarnation, or continued consciousness in any form whatsoever. The fear of Ammit's destruction motivated the elaborate moral preparations that characterized New Kingdom religious practice. The negative confession, which had appeared in scattered form within the coffin texts, achieved its definitive expression as a comprehensive declaration of innocence that addressed each of the 42 divine judges individually. The deceased would recite these denials while standing before the assembled tribunal, proclaiming their freedom from specific categories of sin with increasing desperation as the weighing approached. The structure of the negative confession reflected sophisticated understanding of Egyptian moral psychology and social dynamics. The 42 declarations covered not just obvious crimes, like murder, theft, and adultery, but subtle social transgressions that revealed deep insights into Egyptian values and concerns. The deceased had to deny gossiping about superiors, showing disrespect to parents, cheating in business measurements, displaying arrogance towards social inferiors, or violating the sexual taboos that governed proper relationships within Egyptian society. Each declaration followed a specific formula that identified the relevant judge while proclaiming innocence of particular sins. A typical confession might read, "O Bona Crusher who comes forth from Heracleopolis, I have not told lies." Another declared, "O Eater of Blood who comes forth from the execution block, I have not slaughtered sacred animals." The geographical references that identified each judge's origin point connected the cosmic tribunal to familiar earthly locations, making the abstract moral evaluation feel immediate and personal to Egyptian audiences. The recitation of the negative confession required perfect accuracy and complete sincerity to achieve its protective effect. Any hesitation, mispronunciation, or mental reservation could alert the divine judges to hidden guilt and doom the soul to destruction. This requirement motivated extensive preparation during earthly life, with wealthy Egyptians hiring priests to coach them in proper confession techniques while commissioning practice scrolls that allowed repeated rehearsal of the crucial declarations. The psychological impact of confronting 42 divine judges while reciting denials of specific sins created intense dramatic tension that permeated Egyptian religious imagination. The deceased stood completely naked before the tribunal, stripped of all earthly possessions and social status, while facing beings who possessed absolute knowledge of every action performed during life. The weight of divine scrutiny combined with the terrifying presence of Ammit waiting to devour the unworthy created an atmosphere of cosmic judgment that made earthly legal proceedings seem trivial by comparison. For souls who successfully passed through the weighing process, achieving perfect balance between heart and feather, the transformation that followed represented the ultimate goal of Egyptian religious striving. These justified dead underwent metamorphosis into AKH, a term that scholars translate variously as effective spirits, transfigured beings, or glorified souls. The AKH represented the perfected form of human consciousness that had successfully integrated all aspects of spiritual existence, while gaining the knowledge and power necessary to function among the gods themselves. The transformation into AKH status involved fundamental changes in the soul's capabilities and cosmic position. The justified dead gained the ability to travel freely throughout the universe, visiting any location in the physical world or spiritual realms according to their desires. They could assume any form they chose, appearing as humans, animals, or pure light, while maintaining their essential identity and consciousness. Most importantly, they acquired the knowledge of divine names and magical formulas that allowed them to command supernatural forces and participate in the cosmic processes that maintained universal order. The integration of AKH spirits into the cosmic hierarchy represented the ultimate democratization of Egyptian religious aspiration. Where earlier periods had reserved divine status for pharaohs and select nobles, the New Kingdom theology promised that any soul who lived according to Matthew could achieve effective immortality and cosmic significance. This transformation required no special bloodline or earthly authority, only moral worthiness demonstrated through the weighing of the heart and vindication before the divine tribunal. The cosmic responsibilities that accompanied AKH status reflected Egyptian understanding of the interconnected nature of divine and mortal existence. Justified souls became active participants in maintaining universal order. Joining the crew of Rhea Solar Bark during its daily journey across the sky and nightly passage through the underworld, they assisted in the eternal battle against chaos, helping to defeat the serpent, Apus, and other forces that threatened cosmic stability. Their knowledge and power contributed to the divine processes that ensured the continuation of creation itself. The justified souls who emerged triumphant from the Hall of Two Truths faced a sobering realization that their moral vindication represented merely the entrance examination for an infinitely more perilous journey beyond the cosmic courtroom stretched the vast expanse of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, whose treacherous geography challenged even the most magically protected spirits, with landscapes that defied earthly comprehension and hostile entities that viewed newly arrived souls as either prey or trespassers in their ancient domains. The Duat existed as a parallel universe that mirrored the earthly Nile Valley while inverting its fundamental characteristics in ways that created constant danger for the unwary traveler, where the living Egypt flowed from south to north, following the Nile's current. The underworld's geography reversed this orientation, forcing souls to navigate against familiar patterns while adapting to supernatural laws that governed movement, time, and identity itself. The landscape shifted continuously between recognizable features, fields, rivers, mountains, and cities, and impossible configurations that combined multiple terrains in single locations or presented familiar landmarks rendered hostile through supernatural transformation. The 12-hour nocturnal journey that structured the deceased passage through this realm followed the same temporal framework that governed Rhea Solar Bark during its nightly voyage from western sunset to eastern dawn. Each hour presented distinct challenges that tested different aspects of the soul's preparation, magical knowledge, and moral worthiness, creating a progressive series of trials that grew increasingly difficult as the Prialte advanced toward its climactic confrontation with the forces of absolute chaos. The first hour of the journey, beginning immediately after sunset, introduced souls to the Duat's fundamental disorientation through landscapes that appeared deceptively familiar while concealing deadly traps for the unprepared. The western entrance to the underworld opened through a massive gateway guarded by serpent deities whose coiled bodies stretched across the threshold like living barriers. These guardians, known collectively as the Watchers of the Gate, possessed the authority to deny entry to souls who lacked proper magical credentials or failed to recite the correct passwords that demonstrated their worthiness to enter the realm of the dead. The passwords required for passage through this initial gateway represented some of the most closely guarded secrets in Egyptian magical tradition. Unlike the standardized spells that appeared in most Book of the Dead collections, these entrance formulas varied according to regional traditions and priestly lineages, creating a complex system of magical authentication that prevented unauthorized access to the underworld's mysteries. A typical password might invoke the names of specific deities while describing the soul's relationship to cosmic forces. I am the son of Ra, who emerges from the horizon. I know the hidden names of the powers who dwell in the Duat. Open for me the gates of the western mountain, for I come in peace, as one justified by the weighing of truth. The landscape beyond the entrance gateway resembled a twilight version of the Nile Delta with waterways that branched and merged in patterns that initially seemed familiar to souls accustomed to earthly geography. However, these supernatural rivers flowed with substances other than water, streams of liquid fire that provided illumination for the perpetual darkness, channels of molten silver that reflected distorted images of the soul's earthly memories, and currents of pure darkness that absorbed light and sound while threatening to dissolve any spirit that touched their surface. Navigation through this aquatic maze required specialized knowledge that appeared in the more comprehensive Book of the Dead collections, under titles such as the chapter of not sailing to the east in the god's domain and the spell for traveling upon the waters of the Duat. These formulas provided specific sailing directions that accounted for the supernatural properties of Underworld waterways, while offering protection against the various dangers that lurked beneath their deceptive surfaces. The second and third hours of the journey brought souls into contact with the first major population centers of the Duat, cities whose inhabitants included both blessed dead who had successfully completed their own underworld passages and hostile entities that preyed upon newly arrived spirits. These settlements followed architectural principles that combined familiar Egyptian urban planning with supernatural enhancements that reflected their eternal nature. Buildings constructed from materials that existed only in the afterlife, crystallized starlight, compressed darkness, fossilized music rose to impossible heights while maintaining perfect stability through magical engineering that transcended physical laws. The most significant of these early settlements was the City of the Horizon, where souls could obtain supplies necessary for the remainder of their journey, while receiving guidance from more experienced spirits who had mastered the Duat's navigation challenges. The city's markets offered magical provisions that could not be acquired elsewhere, bread that never spoiled and satisfied hunger permanently, water that quenched thirst while providing supernatural strength, clothing woven from moonbeams that offered protection against hostile magic while remaining lighter than air. However, these beneficial resources came at prices that reflected the supernatural economy governing afterlife transactions. Souls could not purchase provisions with earthly wealth, as gold and silver possess no value in realms where such materials form the basic building blocks of architecture and landscape. Instead, the Duat's economy operated according to principles of knowledge exchange, magical energy transfer, and memory trading that required visitors to surrender portions of their earthly experiences in return for supernatural assistance. The fourth and fifth hours introduced souls to the Duat's more hostile territories, where the landscape itself became actively antagonistic toward intruders. The Valley of the Knife, which stretched across the Underworld's central region, featured terrain that shifted constantly between solid ground and razor-sharp blades that emerged from the earth without warning. Souls attempting to cross this region faced the constant threat of being cut to pieces by invisible weapons that responded to their movements by materializing at precisely the wrong moments. The magical protection required for safe passage through the Valley of the Knife involved spells that rendered the deceased temporarily incorporeal, allowing them to phase through solid matter while maintaining enough physical presence to continue their journey. These transformation formulas preserved in texts, such as the chapter of not being cut apart in the god's domain, required precise timing and perfect pronunciation to achieve their protective effects. Any error in recitation could leave the soul partially materialized at the moment when blades emerged from the ground, resulting in spiritual wounds that would never heal and permanent damage to the deceased essential nature. Beyond the Valley of the Knife lay the Lake of Fire, a vast body of molten flame that stretched beyond the horizon while emanating heat that could incinerate unprepared souls at considerable distances. This supernatural conference burned with temperatures that exceeded any earthly fire, fed by the accumulated anger and hatred of condemned spirits who had failed the weighing of the heart and been cast into its depths for eternal punishment. The lake surface churned constantly with waves of liquid flame that rose hundreds of cubits into the Rao, before crashing down in explosions that illuminated the surrounding landscape with hellish light. The Lake of Fire served multiple functions within the Duat's cosmic geography. It provided punishment for the morally unworthy, while creating an impossible barrier that protected the deeper regions of the underworld from casual intrusion. Only souls who possessed the most powerful protective magic could survive the crossing, and even then, success required supernatural assistance from specialized ferrymen who operated vessels constructed from materials that could withstand the lake's destructive heat. The boats used for crossing the Lake of Fire represented marvels of supernatural engineering that combined practical navigation requirements with magical protection systems. These vessels, described in texts as being constructed from the bones of the primordial serpent and wood from the tree of life, possessed hulls that repelled liquid fire, while sails woven from phoenix feathers provided propulsion through the superheated atmosphere above the lake surface. The ferrymen who operated these craft belonged to an ancient order of spirits, who had mastered the lake's navigation challenges through millennia of experience. But their services came at prices that reflected the extreme dangers involved in the crossing. The passwords required for securing passage across the Lake of Fire represented some of the most complex magical formulas preserved in Egyptian religious literature. These incantations had to acknowledge the ferryman's authority while demonstrating the soul's worthiness to receive assistance, incorporating specific references to cosmic events and divine relationships that prove the deceased possessed legitimate claim to safe passage. A typical formula might declare, "I am the flame that burns in the eye of I am the light that illuminates the darkness of the primordial waters. Fly me across the lake of fire, for I know the secret names of the powers who dwell in its depths, and I come bearing the seal of Thoth, who records all truth." The 6th and 7th hours brought souls into the domain of Sa, the ancient falcon-headed deity who ruled over the most mysterious and dangerous region of the entire Duat. The cavern of Sakar existed as a vast underground complex that stretched beneath the underworld surface, its tunnels and chambers carved from living rock that pulsed with supernatural energy, while emanating sounds that resembled the breathing of some impossibly large creature. The cavern's geography defied conventional understanding, with passages that led simultaneously in multiple directions and chambers that existed in several locations at once. Sokka himself appeared as a mummified falcon whose bandages concealed wings that could span the entire width of his domain when fully extended. His presence filled the cavern with an aura of ancient power that predated the rise of Osiris, representing primordial forces of death and regeneration that operated according to laws established before the creation of the organized cosmos. Unlike other underworld deities who maintained recognizable personalities and motivations, Sokka embodied pure archetypal energy that responded to the presence of souls according to patterns that seemed arbitrary, but actually reflected cosmic principles too complex for mortal comprehension. The challenges presented within the cavern of Sokka differed fundamentally from the physical dangers encountered in earlier regions of the Duat. Here, souls faced threats to their essential identity and spiritual coherence. As the cavern's atmosphere worked to dissolve the boundaries that maintained individual consciousness, the rock walls themselves absorbed memories and personality traits from passing spirits, gradually reducing complex souls to simplified essences that could be more easily processed by the cavern's mysterious functions. Protection against these identity dissolution effects required spells that reinforced the soul's psychological boundaries while maintaining clear awareness of personal history and individual characteristics. The magical formulas developed for Sa's domain, preserved in chapters such as the spell for not forgetting one's name in the god's domain, involved repeated recitation of biographical information, family relationships, and personal accomplishments that served to anchor the soul's identity against the cavern's erosive influences. The 8th and 9th hours of the underworld journey brought souls into direct contact with the cosmic battle that raged eternally between order and chaos. As Riez's solar bark engaged in its nightly combat with Apuz, the serpent of absolute destruction, whose very existence threatened the continuation of creation itself. This confrontation took place in the deepest region of the Duat, where the foundations of reality grew thin and the laws that governed existence became fluid and uncertain. Apophis appeared as a serpent of impossible size whose coils could encircle the entire universe, while his head rose above the highest heavens and his tail descended below the deepest foundations of the earth. His scales gleamed with anti-light that absorbed illumination from any source, while his eyes burned with hatred that had accumulated since the moment of creation. Unlike other hostile entities in the Duat who possessed specific motivations or territorial concerns, Apuz embodied pure negation, the fundamental force that sought to return all existence to the primordial chaos that had preceded organized creation. The battle between Rai and Apuz followed patterns that repeated nightly while remaining eternally uncertain in their outcome. Rai's solar bark, crewed by the most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon, would approach the serpent's domain, armed with weapons forged from crystallized sunlight and spells that contained the concentrated power of divine speech. Apuz would rise from the depths to meet this challenge, his massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow the entire solar disk, while his coils sought to crush the divine vessel and its crew. The souls traveling through this region during the cosmic battle faced dangers that transcended ordinary threats to their continued existence. The clash between order and chaos created zones of reality distortion, where the normal laws governing spiritual existence became unreliable or reversed entirely. Souls might find themselves aging backward through their entire existence, experiencing their memories in reverse order while losing the accumulated wisdom that had enabled them to reach this advanced stage of their journey. Others could become trapped in temporal loops that repeated the same moments endlessly, preventing any progress toward their ultimate destination while slowly draining their spiritual energy. The magical protection required for surviving the cosmic battle involved alignment with the forces of order through specific ritual actions and verbal formulas that demonstrated the soul's commitment to maintaining cosmic stability. These spells, preserved in texts such as the chapter of repelling Apophis and the spell for joining the crew of Rai, required souls to actively participate in the battle by adding their own spiritual energy to the divine forces opposing chaos. This participation carried significant risks, as souls who proved inadequate for cosmic combat could be consumed by the very forces they sought to assist. The 10th and 11th hours of the journey brought souls into the final approach toward the eastern horizon, where the successful completion of the Underworld passage would culminate in resurrection and transformation into effective spirits. However, these concluding stages presented some of the most subtle and dangerous challenges of the entire journey, as entities known as the Blood and various categories of demon spirits made their final attempts to prevent souls from achieving their ultimate goal. The Eaters of Blood represented a category of hostile entity that had evolved specifically to prey upon souls who had successfully navigated most of the Duat's challenges but remained vulnerable during the final stages of their transformation. These creatures appeared as emaciated humanoid figures whose skin had been stretched tight over skeletal frames, while their mouths had enlarged into gaping maws filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Their eyes glowed with supernatural hunger that had remained unsatisfied for millennia, as they fed exclusively upon the spiritual essence of souls who had nearly completed their afterlife journey. The hunting strategies employed by the Eaters of Blood involved psychological manipulation designed to exploit the exhaustion and relief that souls experienced after surviving the earlier challenges of their underworld passage. These entities would approach nearly successful spirits while disguised as helpful guides or fellow travelers, offering assistance with the final navigation challenges while gradually draining their victims' spiritual energy through seemingly innocent contact. By the time souls realize the true nature of their helpers, they often lack sufficient strength to resist the feeding process that would doom them to destruction within sight of their ultimate goal. The backward walking spirits represented another category of threat that emerged during the final hours of the underworld journey. These entities had once been souls who successfully completed their own passage through the Duat but became corrupted through unknown processes that reversed their spiritual development and transformed them into obstacles for subsequent travelers. They move through the underworld's geography in reverse temporal sequence, experiencing events in backward order while maintaining enough awareness to recognize and interfere with souls attempting to complete their forward journey. The threat posed by backward walking spirits involved their ability to create temporal distortions that could trap unwary souls in causal loops or redirect their progress toward earlier stages of the underworld journey. A soul approaching the eastern exit might suddenly find itself back at the western entrance, forced to repeat the entire 12-hour passage while lacking the magical resources that had enabled their initial progress. These temporal attacks proved particularly insidious because they left victims unaware that anything unusual had occurred, creating the illusion of continued progress while actually preventing any advancement toward their ultimate goal. The protective measures required for the final stages of the underworld journey involved specialized equipment and magical formulas that differed significantly from the spells used during earlier portions of the passage. Souls needed amulets constructed from materials that existed only in the deepest regions of the Duat: crystallized time, fossilized light, compressed space, which provided protection against temporal manipulation and spiritual drainage. The magical boats used for navigation during these final hours required hulls inscribed with formulas that maintained forward temporal momentum while preventing backward displacement, creating vessels that could resist the reality distortions generated by hostile entities. The transformation spells that enabled safe passage through the final regions represented the culmination of Egyptian magical development, combining elements from every major period of religious innovation while adding new formulas specifically designed for the unique challenges of the Eastern approach. These incantations required perfect synchronization between verbal recitation, ritual gestures, and mental visualization, creating complex magical performances that demanded years of preparation to execute successfully. The slightest error in timing or pronunciation could leave souls vulnerable to attack during the most critical moments of their transformation process. The successful navigation through the Duat's treacherous landscape brought souls into direct contact with a vast hierarchy of supernatural beings whose roles in the afterlife journey ranged from benevolent guidance to absolute destruction. This pantheon of death represented one of the most complex theological systems ever developed by human civilization, featuring dozens of major deities, hundreds of minor spirits, and countless hostile entities whose interactions created the dramatic framework within which every soul's eternal fate would be determined. At the apex of this divine hierarchy stood Osiris, the green-skinned god whose own death and resurrection had established the fundamental template for human hopes of afterlife survival. Unlike the solar deities who ruled the living world through displays of power and cosmic authority, Osiris governed the realm of the dead through personal experience of mortality's ultimate challenge. His mythological biography read like the archetypal hero's journey, beginning with his benevolent rule over a golden age of Egyptian civilization and culminating in his transformation into the supreme judge of the deceased. The murder of Osiris by his jealous brother Seth represented more than simple fraternal rivalry. It embodied the cosmic struggle between order and chaos that permeated every aspect of Egyptian religious thought. Seth's jealousy stemmed from his recognition that Osiris possessed the natural authority and moral worthiness that made him the rightful heir to their father GB's earthly kingdom. The elaborate nature of Seth's plot, involving the construction of a perfectly fitted coffin that would trap Osiris during a banquet, demonstrated the calculating intelligence that made chaos such a formidable opponent to divine order. The dismemberment of Osiris's body after his initial murder added layers of meaning that resonated throughout Egyptianary practices. Seth's decision to scatter the pieces across the length of Egypt transformed the god's suffering into a geographical reality that connected every region of the kingdom to the resurrection mythology. Each nome could claim to possess a portion of Osiris's sacred remains, creating a network of holy sites that made the god's presence immediate and personal for worshippers throughout the Nile Valley. Isis's search for her husband's scattered remains established her as the archetypal powerful, mourning widow whose magical knowledge and unwavering devotion could overcome even death itself. Her transformation from grieving wife to powerful sorceress occurred through her mastery of the magical formulas necessary for reassembling Osiris's body and restoring his vital functions. The spells she developed during this process became the foundation for all subsequent Egyptian mummification practices, as mortal embalmers sought to replicate the divine techniques that had achieved the first resurrection in cosmic history. The sexual union between Isis and the temporarily restored Osiris, which resulted in the conception of Horus, represented the triumph of life over death through the continuation of divine bloodlines. This miraculous conception occurred while Osiris remained technically dead, demonstrating that properly preserved bodies could maintain their essential functions even after the departure of the soul. The magical techniques employed by Isis during this process provided the theological justification for the elaborate mummification procedures that Egyptian embalmer would perform on countless mortal remains throughout the pharaonic period. Osiris's transformation into ruler of the dead followed naturally from his unique qualification as the only major deity who had personally experienced mortality while retaining his divine nature. His green skin color symbolized the regenerative power of vegetation that died each year during the Nile's low season before returning to life with the annual flood. His mummified appearance with arms crossed over his chest while holding the crook and flail of royal authority presented him as the perfected form of every properly prepared, deceased person who sought to follow his example of death and resurrection. The judicial authority that Osiris exercised over the dead stemmed from his personal understanding of mortality's challenges, combined with his divine wisdom and absolute moral purity. Unlike living rulers whose decisions might be influenced by political considerations or personal relationships, Osiris judged souls according to purely ethical criteria that reflected cosmic principles of justice and truth. His court, in the Hall of Two Truths, operated according to legal procedures that guaranteed fair treatment for every soul, regardless of their earthly status or the circumstances of their death. The iconography surrounding Osiris emphasized his dual nature as both deceased victim and triumphant ruler through carefully chosen symbolic elements that appeared consistently across thousands of years of artistic representation. His white mummy wrappings signified the purity that death had restored to his form, while the green skin visible beneath these bandages represented his continued vitality and regenerative power. The false beard attached to his chin marked his royal status, while its distinctive curved shape distinguished him from living pharaohs who wore straight ceremonial beards during official functions. Working in close partnership with Osiris throughout the judgment process was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, whose mastery of mummification techniques and intimate knowledge of death's physical realities made him indispensable to the proper functioning of the afterlife bureaucracy. Anubis' canine appearance reflected the practical origins of his divine authority, as jackals were commonly observed in Egyptian cemeteries where they served as natural guardians against tomb robbers, while occasionally disturbing improperly protected burials. The theological elevation of Anubis, from cemetery scavenger to divine protector, represented one of the most sophisticated transformations in Egyptian religious development. The priests who developed his mythology recognized that jackal cemetery behavior actually demonstrated protective instincts rather than destructive ones. These animals attacked human intruders who threatened burial sites, while leaving properly mummified remains undisturbed. This observation led to Anubis' identification as the natural guardian of the dead, whose presence ensured the security of properly prepared burials. Anubis' role as divine embalmer required him to possess complete knowledge of every technique necessary for preserving human remains against the corrupting effects of time and decay. His mythological mastery of these procedures began with his preparation of Osiris's dismembered body, when he developed the fundamental methods that would guide all subsequent mummification practices. The 70-day process that became standard for elite burials replicated the time period that Anubis required to perfect his preservation techniques on the first divine corpse. The psychological aspects of Anubis' function as Psychope, the guide who escorted souls through the underworld's dangers, reflected his unique position as the deity who understood both the physical and spiritual dimensions of death. His intimate knowledge of corpse preparation gave him insights into the relationship between body and soul that other gods lacked, while his extensive experience in cemetery environments made him familiar with the various threats that could endanger deceased spirits during their vulnerable transition period. The guidance that Anubis provided to newly deceased souls involved more than simple navigation assistance. He served as counselor, protector, and advocate throughout the complex process of afterlife adaptation. His presence during the weighing of the heart ceremony ensured that the scales operated with perfect accuracy, while his knowledge of proper confession procedures helped souls present their cases most effectively before the divine tribunal. The trust that souls placed in Anubis reflected their recognition that he possessed both the power and the motivation to ensure fair treatment during their most vulnerable moments. The artistic representations of Anubis emphasized his reliability and protective nature through iconographic elements that distinguished him from more volatile deities whose assistance might prove unpredictable. His black fur color symbolized the fertile soil of the Nile Valley that gave life to new crops each year, while also representing the darkened skin of properly mummified bodies that had achieved preservation against decay. His alert, upright ears indicated his constant attention to the needs of souls under his protection, while his human hands demonstrated his ability to perform the delicate manipulations required for proper mummification procedures. Supporting these two central figures of death and judgment was an extensive hierarchy of specialized deities whose specific functions addressed particular aspects of afterlife, preparation, and navigation. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, served as the cosmic record-keeper whose scrolls contained complete documentation of every soul's earthly deeds and moral standing. His presence during judgment proceedings ensured that all evidence would be accurately recorded and properly evaluated according to established divine legal procedures. Thoth's mastery of hieroglyphic writing made him indispensable to the proper functioning of afterlife bureaucracy, as the complex legal procedures governing soul evaluation required extensive documentation and careful record-keeping. His scrolls contained not only factual accounts of each soul's earthly behavior, but also the magical formulas necessary for various stages of afterlife transformation. The spells preserved in the Book of the Dead collections traced their ultimate authority to Thoth's original compositions, which had established the fundamental principles governing posthumous magical protection. The intellectual authority that Thoth exercised within the divine hierarchy reflected Egyptian recognition that knowledge and wisdom were essential components of effective rulership, whether over living subjects or deceased souls. His counsel influenced the decisions of other gods, while his magical expertise provided solutions to problems that exceeded the capabilities of deities who specialized in other areas of divine administration. The respect accorded to Thoth demonstrated Egyptian appreciation for scholarly achievement and intellectual accomplishment as legitimate sources of power and authority. Nephis, the sister of Isis and wife of Seth, occupied a complex position within the death pantheon that reflected the ambiguous moral categories that characterized many Egyptian deities. Despite her marriage to the god of chaos and violence, Nephis consistently supported the forces of order during crucial moments of cosmic crisis. Her assistance to Isis during the search for Osiris's scattered remains established her as a protective deity whose loyalty transcended family obligations when cosmic stability was at stake. The mourning functions that Nephis performed alongside Isis created the archetypal pattern for professional mirrors who would participate in Egyptian funeral ceremonies throughout the pharaonic period. Her distinctive wailing cry, described in religious texts as capable of reaching the ears of gods in the highest heavens, provided the vocal expression of grief that helped deceased souls recognize the love and respect they continue to receive from the living world. The emotional intensity of her mourning demonstrated that death represented a genuine loss that deserved acknowledgement and commemoration rather than stoic acceptance. The four sons of Horus represented specialized protective deities whose specific responsibility involved safeguarding the preserved organs of mummified bodies against corruption and hostile magic. These four gods, Emeti, Happy Dwatf, and Kinaf, each protected a different organ while embodying particular aspects of the deceased essential nature that required preservation for successful resurrection. The canopic jar guardianship created a distributed protection system that prevented single-point failures from compromising the entire mummification process. Mseti, depicted with a human head, protected the liver while representing the deceased capacity for emotional processing and interpersonal relationships. The liver's association with emotional life reflected Egyptian medical understanding of this organ's role in processing the substances that influence mood and temperament. Mseti's human appearance emphasized his connection to the social aspects of personality that would need restoration in the afterlife for souls to maintain their individual identity and relationship capabilities. Happy, shown with a baboon head, guarded the lungs while embodying the breath of life that animated all living creatures. The lungs' function in processing air connected them to the divine breath that had originally created life from primordial matter, making their preservation essential for resurrection. Happy's baboon form reflected these animals' association with the dawn chorus that greeted the sun's daily rebirth, linking lung protection to the cyclical renewal processes that govern both cosmic and individual resurrection. Duramut, portrayed with a jackal head, protected the stomach while representing the deceased capacity for processing and integrating new experiences. The stomach's digestive functions provided a metaphor for the soul's ability to absorb and benefit from the various challenges and opportunities encountered during earthly existence. Duotef's jackal appearance connected him to Anubis while establishing his specific authority over the organ systems responsible for nourishment and growth. Kabasuf, depicted with a falcon head, guarded the intestines while embodying the deceased fundamental life force and vital energy. The intestines' role in extracting nutrients from consumed food made them essential for maintaining the physical vitality that supported spiritual development. Kebis-Nuf's falcon form linked him to Horus and the solar deities whose power provided the energy necessary for all life processes, ensuring that preserved intestines would retain their capacity to support the resurrected body's nutritional needs. The hostile entities that populated the Dua represented the dark mirror image of this protective divine hierarchy, featuring demons and malevolent spirits whose existence served to test the worthiness of souls while providing cosmic balance against the benevolent forces that aided afterlife navigation. These threatening beings ranged from relatively minor nuisances that could be overcome through basic magical protection to cosmic-level threats that required the most powerful spells and divine assistance to survive. The knife-wielding executioners, who appeared throughout various regions of Underworld, embodied the principle of divine justice, carried to its most extreme expression. These entities, described in religious texts as possessing multiple arms that could wield dozens of blades, simultaneously served as cosmic enforcers who eliminated souls that had somehow evaded proper judgment or attempted to access afterlife privileges through deception. Their appearance combined human intelligence with mechanical precision, creating beings that could evaluate complex moral situations while executing their decisions with ruthless efficiency. The anatomical descriptions of these executioner demons emphasized their supernatural nature through impossible physical combinations that transcended normal biological limitations. Some possessed eyes in the backs of their heads that prevented souls from approaching undetected, while others featured arms that could extend to unlimited lengths for striking distant targets. Their weapons included not only conventional blades, but also supernatural cutting implements forged from crystallized pain, compressed screams and fossilized terror that could sever spiritual bonds as easily as physical flesh. The fire-breathing serpents that infested various regions of the Duat represented primordial chaos forces that had survived from the pre-critical period when the universe consisted entirely of undifferentiated potential. These creatures retained the destructive capabilities that had once threatened to prevent the emergence of organized reality, making them particularly dangerous to souls who represented the triumph of order over chaos through their successful resurrection. Their flames burned with temperatures that exceeded normal fire, capable of incinerating not just physical matter, but also the spiritual substances that comprised soul bodies. The magical knowledge required for overcoming these serpentine threats involved understanding their fundamental nature as embodiment of cosmic principles rather than simple predatory animals. The protective spells developed for serpent encounters required souls to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining universal order through specific ritual actions and verbal formulas that prove their worthiness to exist in an organized cosmos. These incantations often involved reciting the names of creation deities while performing gestures that symbolically reenacted the original triumph of order over chaos, the demons, and serpentine guardians that threatened souls throughout. The Duat represented only one category of supernatural challenge facing the deceased during their afterlife journey. Beyond these hostile encounters lay an even more fundamental requirement for posthumous survival. The mastery of Heka, the cosmic force of creation that enabled properly prepared souls to transform themselves into any form necessary for navigating the underworld's constantly shifting demands. This magical power, which the ancient Egyptians understood as the fundamental energy that had brought the universe into existence through divine speech, provided deceased spirits with their most essential tool for overcoming obstacles that could not be defeated through moral worthiness or divine protection alone. Heka represented far more than simple spellcasting or supernatural manipulation of natural forces. The Egyptians conceived of this power as the primordial creative energy that had enabled the creator deity Atum to speak the first words of existence, transforming the undifferentiated chaos of the primeval waters into the organized cosmos of gods, humans, and natural phenomena. When the creator's voice first broke the eternal silence of precation, declaring, "I am," the vibrations of divine speech carried Heka throughout the emerging universe, establishing the fundamental principle that properly spoken words possessed the power to alter reality itself. This understanding of magical power as linguistic creation meant that every spell preserved in the Book of the Dead collections represented a fragment of the same cosmic force that had originally brought the world into being. The deceased, who successfully mastered these formulas, gained access to creative abilities that paralleled those of the gods themselves, enabling transformations that transcended the normal limitations governing mortal existence. The hieroglyphic texts that preserved these spells functioned as technological manuals for operating cosmic forces, providing step-by-step instructions for manipulating the fundamental energies that maintained universal order. The transformation spells that appeared throughout the Book of the Dead collections reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness, identity, and physical form that anticipated modern psychological insights. By millennia, Egyptian theologians recognized that successful shapeshifting required more than simple magical formulas. The deceased had to achieve complete psychological identification with their chosen form while maintaining enough personal awareness to direct the transformation process according to their strategic needs. This dual consciousness demanded extensive preparation and practice that began during earthly life and continued throughout the afterlife journey. The most frequently employed transformation involved the deceased metamorphosis into a falcon, the sacred bird whose association with Horus and Rhea provided divine authority for this shape-shifting, while offering practical advantages for navigating the Duat aerial regions. The falcon transformation spell, preserved as Chapter 77 in the standardized Book of the Dead collections, required the deceased to recite a complex incantation that began with the declaration, "I am the falcon who emerges from the horizon. My talons are the talons of Horus. My wings are the wings of Re." I soar above the earth on currents of divine breath, while my keen eyes perceive all secrets hidden below. The psychological preparation necessary for successful falcon transformation involved extensive meditation on Avon consciousness and behavior patterns that enable the deceased to think and react according to bird-like instincts while retaining human intelligence and memory. This dual awareness proved essential for maintaining the transformation's effectiveness as souls who became completely absorbed in falcon consciousness might lose their ability to navigate toward their ultimate destination or recognize important landmarks along their journey. Conversely, those who remained too focused on human thought patterns could find their transformations incomplete or unstable, leaving them vulnerable to attacks that specifically targeted shapeshifters. The practical advantages offered by falcon form extended beyond simple flight capabilities to include enhanced sensory perception that proved invaluable for detecting hidden dangers throughout the underworld landscape. Falcon eyes possess supernatural acuity that could penetrate magical disguises and identify hostile entities attempting to approach under false appearances. The bird's natural hunting instincts provided early warning systems that alerted transformed souls to potential threats, while their aerial mobility enabled rapid escape from ground-based dangers that might overwhelm pedestrian travelers. The lotus flower transformation represented another crucial shape-shifting option that addressed different categories of afterlife challenges through its association with solar renewal and aquatic navigation. The lotus spell, recorded as Chapter 81 in the Book of the Dead, enabled souls to assume the form of the sacred flower that emerged each morning from the primeval waters, while carrying the newborn sun toward the eastern horizon. This transformation provided protection against water-based threats while offering concealment opportunities that could help souls avoid detection by hostile entities patrolling the Duat's numerous waterways. The lotus transformation formula required the deceased to recite, "I am the lotus that blooms in the waters of creation. My petals unfold with the first light of dawn, while my roots draw sustenance from the primordial depths. I float upon the sacred lake where Re first emerged in his golden bark, and my fragrance carries the breath of life to all who dwell in darkness." The successful execution of this spell demanded complete understanding of plant, consciousness, and growth patterns that differed fundamentally from animal awareness, requiring souls to adapt their thinking processes to vegetative rhythms and responses. The strategic applications of lotus form proved particularly valuable during the water-crossing phases of the Underworld journey, when souls needed to traverse supernatural rivers and lakes that posed specific threats to travelers in human or animal form. The lotus's natural buoyancy provided safe passage across liquid surfaces that might dissolve other forms of spiritual matter, while its association with solar mythology offered protection against the various serpents and hostile spirits that inhabited aquatic regions of the Duat. The flower's ability to close its petals during dangerous periods provided a defensive mechanism that could shield transformed souls from magical attacks while they waited for favorable conditions to resume their journey. The Banu bird transformation occupied a special position among shape-shifting options due to this creature's unique status as the living embodiment of resurrection and renewal principles that governed the entire afterlife process. The Benu, which scholars often identify with the mythological phoenix, represented the soul's capacity for self-regeneration through controlled destruction and rebirth cycles that paralleled the daily death and resurrection of the sun god. The transformation spell for Bennu form, preserved in Chapter 83, provided access to regenerative powers that could restore souls damaged by their passage through the Duat's most dangerous regions. The Bennu transformation incantation declared, "I am the Bennu bird who perches upon the sacred Persa tree in the Temple of Re. I am the soul of Osiris who emerges from the flames of purification. My cry awakens the dead, while my flight carries the promise of resurrection to all who dwell in darkness." I burn with the fire of renewal, while my ashes become the seeds of eternal life. This formula required the most advanced magical knowledge among all transformation spells. As the Bennu's regenerative abilities operated through controlled self-destruction processes that could permanently damage souls who lack sufficient preparation or understanding. The psychological demands of Bennu transformation exceeded those required for other shape-shifting spells. Because this form involved temporary dissolution of the soul's normal boundaries and identity structures, the deceased had to willingly undergo spiritual combustion that destroyed accumulated negative influences while preserving their essential consciousness and moral achievements. This process required absolute confidence in the regeneration mechanism and complete surrender to forces beyond. Conscious control, making transformation accessible only to souls who had achieved advanced levels of spiritual development. The practical applications of Bennu form proved most valuable during encounters with corruption-based threats that sought to contaminate souls through prolonged contact or exposure to polluting influences. The Bennu's purification fire could burn away spiritual contamination, while its regenerative cycle restored the soul's original purity and power. This cleansing capability made Bennu transformation essential for souls who needed to traverse regions of the Duat that were heavily contaminated by the presence of condemned spirits or chaotic entities whose mere proximity could cause lasting damage to unprepared travelers. The protective power derived from knowing the secret names of demons, gates, and divine beings represented another crucial category of magical knowledge that complemented transformation abilities while providing additional layers of supernatural security. Egyptian religious philosophy held that every entity in existence possessed a true name that encapsulated its essential nature and provided the key to understanding its powers, limitations, and proper methods of interaction. The deceased who mastered these naming systems gained significant advantages during their underworld journey, as proper use of secret names could compel cooperation from hostile entities while opening passages through otherwise impossible barriers. The Gate Guardian names preserved in the Book of the Dead collections reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about the specific entities that controlled access to different regions of the Duat. Each major transition point in the underworld landscape was protected by powerful beings whose authority derived from their appointment by the creator gods to maintain cosmic order through controlled access to sensitive areas. These guardians possessed the power to grant or deny passage based on their evaluation of each soul's worthiness and preparation. But they were also bound by cosmic laws that required them to permit access to travelers who demonstrated proper knowledge and credentials. The naming formulas that compelled guardian cooperation typically combined the entity's secret name with specific descriptions of its origins, powers, and cosmic functions that proved the speaker possessed legitimate knowledge rather than casual familiarity. A typical gate-opening incantation might declare, "Open for me, O Guardian, whose name is Swallower of Shadows, who emerged from the primordial darkness when Reeve first spoke the words of creation." I know your secret nature as the protector of the Eastern Gate, who devours the unworthy while guiding the justified toward the light of resurrection. I come bearing the seal of Thoth and the blessing of Osiris, and I speak your hidden name with the authority of one who has been weighed in the balance and found true. The effectiveness of naming magic depended critically on pronunciation accuracy and contextual appropriateness that required extensive preparation and practice to achieve. Mispronounced names could anger the entities they were meant to compel, transforming potential allies into active enemies who would use their considerable powers to prevent the speaker's progress. Similarly, names spoken in inappropriate contexts or without proper ritual preparation might fail to achieve their intended effects while alerting hostile entities to the soul's presence and magical capabilities. The demon-binding names preserved in the more comprehensive Book of the Dead collections provided protection against the fact the various categories of hostile entity that posed specific threats to souls during different phases of their underworld journey. These malevolent beings ranged from relatively minor spirits that sought to steal magical energy from passing travelers to major demons whose powers rivaled those of the gods themselves. The naming spells developed for demon encounters required souls to demonstrate their knowledge of each entity's true nature, while asserting their own authority as justified spirits who possessed legitimate claims to divine protection. The binding formulas typically began with detailed descriptions of the demon's appearance, powers, and preferred hunting methods that proved the speaker possessed genuine knowledge rather than mere hearsay. The incantations then proceeded to recite the entity's secret name while commanding it to withdraw or provide assistance according to cosmic laws governing supernatural interactions. A typical demon-binding spell might declare, "I know you, O demon, whose secret name is Gnawer of Bones, who appears as a man with the head of a crocodile and feeds upon the spiritual essence of the unprotected dead. Your power comes from the chaos that existed before creation, but you are bound by the words of Red to obey those who speak your true name with proper authority." I command you by the power of Osiris and the wisdom of Thoth to withdraw from my path and trouble me no more. The divine names that provided access to godly assistance represented the most powerful category of naming magic, as these formulas could invoke the direct intervention of major deities during critical moments of the afterlife journey. However, the use of divine names carried corresponding risks that reflected the awesome power of the entities being addressed. Gods who were improperly approached or inadequately honored might respond with devastating punishment rather than helpful assistance, making divine naming magic accessible only to souls who had achieved advanced levels of magical knowledge and spiritual preparation. The relationship between spoken word, written text, and magical efficacy formed the theoretical foundation that governed all Egyptian magical practice, establishing principles that determined the success or failure of every supernatural technique employed during the afterlife journey. Egyptian religious philosophy recognized that cosmic creation had occurred through divine speech, making properly spoken words the most powerful force available for manipulating reality. However, the preservation and transmission of these powerful formulas required written texts that could maintain their effectiveness across time while remaining accessible to souls who needed magical protection. The hieroglyphic writing system that preserved magical formulas possessed inherent supernatural properties that enhanced the power of recorded spells while providing additional layers of protection against corruption or interference. Each hieroglyphic sign functioned as both a phonetic symbol and a magical eye dog that carried specific cosmic energies related to its meaning and appearance. The combination of signs into words and sentences created complex energy patterns that reinforced the verbal formulas, while establishing permanent magical structures that could operate independently of their original creators. The scribble techniques developed for recording magical texts involved specialized procedures that enhance the supernatural effectiveness of written spells while ensuring their preservation against the various threats that could compromise their power. The preparation of magical papyrus required ritual purification of materials and tools that removed any contaminating influences while consecrating the writing surface for sacred use. The ink formulations employed for magical texts incorporated substances that possessed inherent supernatural properties: gold dust for solar energy, silver powder for lunar power, crushed precious stones for various specialized effects, creating written words that glowed with their own magical radiance. The pronunciation requirements that governed magical effectiveness reflected Egyptian understanding of the relationship between sound vibrations and cosmic forces that made proper vocal technique essential for successful spellcasting. The hieroglyphic writing system preserved the consonant structure of magical formulas while leaving vowel sounds to be supplied by trained practitioners who had learned proper pronunciation through oral instruction from qualified teachers. This system ensured that magical knowledge remained under the control of properly initiated individuals, while preventing unauthorized persons from accessing dangerous supernatural powers through simple reading. The textual accuracy standards that applied to magical documents exceeded those required for ordinary administrative or literary texts, as even minor errors in magical formulas could compromise their effectiveness or produce unended consequences that endangered the user. Professional scribes who specialized in magical texts underwent extensive training in proofreading techniques and quality control procedures that involved multiple verification stages before any magical document could be considered complete. Master scribes would review each text line by line while comparing it against authoritative templates, correcting any errors in spelling, word order, or hieroglyphic formation that might interfere with the spell's proper function. The regional variations in magical pronunciation and textual transmission created complex challenges for souls who needed to employ spells in areas distant from their original training locations. The same magical formula might be pronounced differently in Memphis, Thebes, and Hermopolis, with each regional tradition claiming authenticity while producing measurably different supernatural effects. Experienced magical practitioners learned to adapt their techniques according to local conditions while maintaining the essential elements that ensured spell effectiveness, regardless of regional variations in pronunciation or textual presentation. The successful mastery of transformation magic and divine nomenclature brought justified souls to the threshold of their ultimate destination. Sekhet Aru, the fields of reeds, where the blessed dead would spend eternity in an idealized version of earthly existence. This paradisical realm represented the culmination of Egyptian religious imagination, a landscape that combined the familiar agricultural rhythms of the Nile Valley with supernatural culture enhancements that transformed mundane farming into a cosmic celebration of life's triumph over death. Sikaru stretched across the eastern regions of the Juot like a vast agricultural estate whose boundaries extended beyond mortal comprehension. The fields themselves measured precisely 1,000 by 1,000 cubits according to the most detailed textual descriptions, creating a perfect square that reflected the Egyptian appreciation for geometric harmony and mathematical precision in cosmic architecture. This supernatural farmland, divided into distinct agricultural zones, each dedicated to specific crops that grew with abundance impossible in the earthly realm. The eastern portion of the fields contained barley that reached extraordinary heights of 4 cubits, creating golden waves of grain that swayed in breezes that carried the breath of gods across the eternal landscape. This barley possessed qualities that transcended ordinary agricultural products. Each grain contained concentrated nourishment that could satisfy hunger permanently, while the stalks themselves glowed with internal light that illuminated the surrounding areas with warm amber radiance. The harvesting of this supernatural crop required no physical labor, as the grain would separate from its stalks at the mere approach of blessed souls, while arranging itself into neat bundles ready for processing. The western regions produced emmer wheat that towered even higher at 7 cubits, creating cathedral-like groves of grain whose tops disappeared into the eternal blue sky of the afterlife. This wheat possessed even more remarkable properties than the eastern barley, with individual kernels that contain the concentrated essence of life itself. Bread baked from this supernatural wheat would never spoil or lose its freshness, while providing nourishment that strengthened both body and spirit for the various activities that occupied the blessed dead throughout their eternal existence. Between these agricultural zones flowed an intricate network of canals that carried the celestial waters of the divine Nile, connecting the earthly river to its cosmic source in the primordial waters of creation. These waterways maintained perfect levels throughout all seasons, never experiencing the floods and droughts that characterized earthly agriculture. The water itself possessed crystalline clarity that revealed the sandy bottom of even the deepest channels, while its temperature remained constant at the perfect level for both irrigation and the various aquatic activities that the blessed dead enjoyed during their leisure time. The supernatural abundance that characterized every aspect of Sekhet Aru reflected Egyptian theological understanding of the Fa as a realm where the limitations and uncertainties that plagued earthly existence had been permanently overcome. The blessed dead would never again face the anxiety of poor harvests, insufficient rainfall, or crop failures that could threaten survival in the mortal world. Instead, they inhabited a landscape where agricultural success was guaranteed by divine decree, creating an environment of perpetual prosperity and security that allowed souls to focus on higher pursuits without concern for basic survival needs. The flora that adorned the fields of reeds extended far beyond agricultural crops to include ornamental plants and trees that created a park-like atmosphere throughout the eternal landscape. Lotus pools dotted the terrain at regular intervals, their sacred flowers blooming continuously in displays of blue, white, and pink petals that released fragrances capable of inducing states of divine ecstasy in those who inhaled their perfume. The lotus plants themselves served as gathering places where blessed souls could rest during their agricultural labors, while contemplating the beauty and perfection of their eternal home. Sycamore trees provided shade and shelter throughout the fields, their broad canopies creating cool retreats where their blessed dead could escape the gentle warmth of the eternal sun when they desired periods of quiet reflection. These trees bore fruit continuously, producing figs and dates that possessed flavors unknown in the earthly realm, while providing additional sources of supernatural nourishment. The wood of these trees could be harvested without harming the plants themselves, as new growth would immediately replace any material removed for construction or fuel purposes. Palm groves mark the boundaries between different agricultural zones, while providing additional sources of food and building materials for the blessed inhabitants. The date palms grew to enormous heights while producing fruit that ripened continuously rather than following seasonal cycles. The palm fronds could be woven into baskets, mats, and other useful items that possess supernatural durability, never wearing out or requiring replacement despite constant use. The architectural features that dotted the landscape of Sitaru reflected the sophisticated urban planning that characterized Egyptian civilization, while incorporating supernatural enhancements that made these structures perfect for their eternal inhabitants. Villages and towns appeared at regular intervals throughout the fields, their buildings constructed from materials that combined familiar earthly substances with cosmic elements that ensured permanent durability and comfort. The houses provided to blessed souls replicated the architectural styles they had known during earthly life, while eliminating all the maintenance requirements and structural limitations that had characterized mortal dwellings. Walls built from supernatural brick never cracked or weathered, while roofs made from celestial materials provided perfect protection against all forms of precipitation or temperature variation. The interiors remained constantly clean and comfortable with furnishings that adjusted automatically to their occupants' preferences and needs. The social organization that governed life in the fields of reeds preserved many of the hierarchical relationships that had structured Egyptian society, while eliminating the conflicts and inequalities that had created suffering in the mortal world. The blessed dead maintained their earthly occupations and professional identities, continuing to work as farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and administrators while enjoying the enhanced capabilities and perfect working conditions that characterize the afterlife environment. Farmers in Sitaru possessed supernatural knowledge of agricultural techniques that guaranteed perfect crops while requiring minimal physical effort. Their plows moved through the soil automatically, guided by divine intelligence that ensured optimal seed placement and cultivation practices. The irrigation systems operated through magical principles that delivered precisely the right amount of water to each plant without any need for manual labor or complex engineering systems. Craftsmen worked with materials that possessed ideal properties for their specific trades while having access to tools that never dulled or broke during use. Carpenters shaped wood that remained perfectly straight and strong while taking on whatever form the craftsman envisioned. Metal workers forged implements from supernatural alloys that combined the best qualities of earthly metals, while adding properties that made their products infinitely durable and beautiful. Scribes continued their intellectual pursuits with access to unlimited supplies of the finest papyrus and ink, while possessing enhanced mental capabilities that allowed them to compose texts of unprecedented eloquence and wisdom. Their writings would be automatically preserved against all forms of deterioration, while remaining accessible to other blessed souls who shared their scholarly interests. The family relationships that had provided meaning and structure during earthly existence continued to flourish in the afterlife environment, with spouses, parents, children, and extended family members maintaining their emotional bonds while enjoying the perfect harmony that characterized all aspects of existence in Sitaru. The conflicts and misunderstandings that had sometimes strained family relationships during mortal life were permanently resolved through the enhanced wisdom and emotional maturity that all blessed souls acquired upon entering the eternal realm. Marriage relationships achieve their ideal form in the afterlife, with couples experiencing perfect compatibility and mutual understanding while retaining the individual personalities and interests that had attracted them to each other during earthly life. The physical aspects of marriage continued in enhanced form, with blessed souls possessing bodies that combined the vigor of youth with the wisdom of maturity, while remaining eternally beautiful and healthy. Parent-child relationships flourished without the generational conflicts that had sometimes characterized these bonds during mortal existence. Children who had died young were reunited with their parents in forms that reflected their full potential development, while aging parents appeared in their prime years of strength and beauty. The wisdom and experience that parents had accumulated during earthly life could be shared freely with their children without the resistance or misunderstanding that had sometimes hindered such communication in the mortal world. The integration of Shakti figures into the agricultural economy of Setaru represented one of the most ingenious innovations in Egyptian afterlife planning, addressing the potential concern that eternal agricultural labor might become tedious or burdensome for blessed souls who had achieved divine status. These magical servants, created through sophisticated technology during the mummification process, provided automated labor that could handle the routine aspects of farming while allowing their masters to focus on the more creative and intellectually stimulating aspects of eternal existence. The shapy figures themselves appeared as miniature mummified servants, typically crafted from wood or stone, and inscribed with specific magical formulas that activated their service capabilities upon entering the afterlife realm. The standard Shapi spell, preserved as Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, commanded these figures to respond whenever their master was called upon to perform agricultural labor. "Oh, she, if I am summoned or if I'm detailed to do any work which has to be done in the realm of the dead, to make arable the fields, to irrigate the land, to convey sand from east to west, then you shall say, 'Here I am, I will do it.'" The magical technology that animated Shapi figures operated through principles of sympathetic magic that connected the small figurines to their full-size counterparts in the afterlife realm. The deceased's name inscribed on each Shapi established the spiritual link that enabled remote control of these servants while the magical formulas carved into their bodies provided the specific instructions that govern their behavior and capabilities. The most sophisticated Shapi collections included different types of figures, specialized for particular agricultural tasks, some designed for plowing, others for harvesting, still others for irrigation management and crop processing. Wealthy individuals could commission complete Shapi workforces that included not only basic laborers but also overseer figures equipped with whips and other symbols of authority that enabled them to supervise the activities of ordinary worker Shapis. These supervisory figures possessed enhanced magical intelligence that allowed them to coordinate complex agricultural projects while ensuring that all tasks were completed according to their master's preferences and standards. The mathematical precision that governed Shabi deployment reflected Egyptian appreciation for systematic organizations and efficient resource management. The ideal Shapi collection contained 401 figures, 365 worker shapes to handle daily agricultural tasks throughout the eternal year, plus 36 overseer shapes to supervise these workers in groups of 10. This mathematical arrangement ensured that agricultural labor would be distributed evenly while providing adequate supervision to maintain high standards of work quality. The integration of justified souls into the cosmic cycle that governed universal order represented the ultimate achievement of Egyptian religious aspiration, transforming individual salvation into active participation in the divine processes that maintained creation itself. The blessed dead, who had successfully navigated the Underworld's challenges and established their residence in Setaru, gained the opportunity to join Re's solar bark during its daily journey across the sky, participating directly in the cosmic battle against chaos while contributing their own spiritual energy to the forces that preserved universal stability. The solar bark itself appeared as a magnificent vessel constructed from materials that existed only in the divine realm. Gold that never tarnished, silver that reflected absolute truth, cedarwood from the primordial tree of life that grew at the center of creation. The boat's dimensions exceeded those of any earthly vessel, while maintaining perfect proportions that reflected cosmic harmony and mathematical precision. Its prow featured elaborate decorative elements that serve both aesthetic and magical functions, creating protective barriers against the various hostile forces that threaten the sun's daily journey. The crew positions available to blessed souls aboard the solar bark reflected their individual capabilities and interests, while providing opportunities for meaningful contribution to cosmic processes. Former scribes could assist Thoth in maintaining the navigational records that documented the sun's precise position throughout its daily journey, while former soldiers could join the armed guard that protected the vessel against attacks by demons and chaotic entities. Former farmers could tend the supernatural gardens that provided food and other necessities for the divine crew, while former craftsmen could maintain the boat's equipment and perform the various repairs that kept this cosmic vessel in perfect operating condition. The daily defeat of Apuz, the serpent of chaos, whose destruction threatened the continuation of creation itself, provided the most dramatic and significant opportunity for blessed souls to contribute to universal welfare. This cosmic battle occurred during the sun's nightly passage through the underworld, when the forces of order confronted their ultimate enemy in combat that determined whether the sun would successfully rise again to begin a new day. The participation of justified souls in this eternal conflict transformed individual salvation into cosmic service, demonstrating that the afterlife represented not merely personal reward, but integration into the divine community responsible for maintaining universal order. The blessed dead who joined this battle brought their own spiritual energy and magical knowledge to support the established gods, while gaining deeper understanding of the cosmic principles that governed all existence. Their involvement in defeating chaos ensured that their eternal existence would remain meaningful and purposeful rather than becoming an endless cycle of agricultural routine or leisure activities. The cosmic battles against chaos that engaged justified souls aboard Solar Bark represented the ultimate expression of Egyptian afterlife theology. But the textual traditions that preserved these beliefs underwent constant evolution throughout the Pharaonic period. As the new kingdom matured and expanded its territorial control across the eastern Mediterranean, the standardized Book of the Dead collections that had emerged from Theban scriptorums began encountering regional variations and foreign influences that challenged their theological monopoly while creating new opportunities for textual innovation and adaptation. The Theban recession that dominated New Kingdomary literature achieved its distinctive character through concentrated artistic and scribal resources that flowed into the southern capital during Egypt's imperial zenith. The workshops attached to Karnak and Luxor temples employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen who transformed the relatively simple vignettes of earlier periods into elaborate narrative scenes that rivaled royal tomb decorations in their sophistication and beauty. These Theban manuscripts featured full-color illustrations painted on the finest papyrus available, with individual scenes extending across multiple columns of text while incorporating architectural elements, landscape details, and costume designs that reflected contemporary artistic standards. The artistic innovations that characterized Theban production created new categories of visual storytelling that enhanced the magical effectiveness of traditional spells, while appealing to customers who valued aesthetic beauty alongside supernatural protection. The judgment scene before Osiris, which had appeared as a simple weighing balance in earlier texts, expanded into complex courtroom dramas that showed the deceased's entire moral evaluation process, from initial arrival through final vindication. These elaborate vignettes depicted the 42 divine judges in individual detail, each rendered according to iconographic conventions that emphasized their specific areas of moral authority, while creating visually striking compositions that filled entire papyrus sheets. The Hall of Two Truths itself received architectural treatment that transformed the abstract concept of cosmic justice into a recognizable building that combined familiar temple elements with supernatural enhancements. The artist depicted massive columns decorated with lotus and papyrus capitals that supported ceilings adorned with astronomical diagrams showing the deceased destination among the imperishable stars. The floor patterns incorporated geometric designs that guided the soul's movement through the judgment process, while creating visual pathways that connected different elements of the scene into coherent narrative sequences. The Theban tradition's emphasis on Osiris as the supreme judge of the dead reflected the political and religious prominence that this deity had achieved in the southern capital, where his cult center at Abydos attracted pilgrims from throughout the Mediterranean world. The elaborate Osirian theology that developed in Theban scriptorums portrayed the god's death and resurrection as the archetypal pattern for human afterlife, hopes, while emphasizing his role as merciful judge who sought to vindicate worthy souls rather than condemn them to destruction. This theological emphasis produced manuscript collections that featured extensive Assyrian hymns and prayers, alongside the traditional transformation spells, creating comprehensive religious anthologies that served both magical and devotional purposes. The coloristic innovations that distinguish the manuscripts from their predecessors involved sophisticated pigment, technologies that created previously impossible visual effects while enhancing the magical properties of illustrated texts. Gold leaf applied to divine figures made them literally glow with solar radiance that symbolized their cosmic authority, while silver details on lunar deities reflected light in ways that suggested their connection to nighttime mysteries. Lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, provided deep blue backgrounds that evoked the primordial waters of Kana. Creation, or malachite green, painted on vegetation symbols, connected earthly fertility to cosmic regeneration cycles. The standardization of iconographic elements within the workshops created visual vocabularies that remained consistent across different manuscripts, while allowing individual artists to express their creativity through variations in composition, color selection, and decorative details. The weighing scales that appeared in judgment scenes followed established proportional relationships that ensured magical effectiveness while permitting artistic interpretation of supporting elements such as architectural settings, divine costumes, and landscape features. This balance between standardization and creativity produced manuscripts that maintained theological orthodoxy while achieving remarkable artistic diversity. Regional variations in spell selection and textual arrangement reflected the persistence of local theological traditions that had developed during periods of political fragmentation and continued to influence religious practice despite New Kingdom unification efforts. The Mate tradition centered around the ancient capital and its associated pyramid text heritage maintained strong. Preferences for solar theology and stellar transformation spells that trace their origins back to Old Kingdom royal literature. Memphis workshops produced manuscripts that emphasized the deceased identification with Reed during his daily solar journey, while incorporating archaic spell versions that preserved linguistic forms from earlier periods. The Memphis preference for conservative textual transmission created manuscripts that served as repositories for ancient religious formulas that might otherwise have been lost during the process of New Kingdom standardization. These collections often included variant spell versions that provided alternative approaches to common afterlife challenges, giving customers access to multiple magical solutions for problems such as underworld navigation, demon encounters, and divine communication. The scholarly reputation of Memphis scriptorums attracted clients who valued textual completeness and historical authenticity over contemporary, artistic innovations. The astronomical knowledge that Memphis workshops incorporated into their manuscripts reflected the city's long-standing association with solar theology and celestial observation. These texts included detailed star maps that showed the deceased's anticipated transformation into imperishable stars, while providing navigational information for souls traveling through the cosmic regions above the earthly plane. The central data preserved in Mate manuscripts enabled proper timing of various afterlife transformations, while connecting individual salvation to the cyclical processes that governed universal order. The Heraclatan tradition, based in the Middle Egyptian Psyche that had served as capital during the First Intermediate Period, developed distinctive approaches to underworld geography and demon encounter spells that reflected the region's historical experience with political chaos and social upheaval. Heraclean manuscripts featured extensive collections of protective formulas designed to overcome hostile entities and navigate dangerous territories, creating comprehensive survival guides for souls facing the Duat's most challenging regions. These texts emphasized practical magical knowledge over theological speculation, providing step-by-step instructions for overcoming specific obstacles while avoiding abstract discussions of cosmic principles. The demon-binding spells that characterized Hieropolitan collections reflected centuries of accumulated experience with supernatural threats that had plagued the region during periods of political instability. These formulas provided detailed descriptions of hostile entities' appearances, hunting methods, and vulnerabilities, while offering multiple strategies for avoiding or overcoming their attacks. The psychological insights embedded in these texts revealed sophisticated understanding of fear management and confidence building that enabled souls to maintain their composure during terrifying encounters with cosmic predators. The geographical knowledge preserved in Hieropolitan manuscripts included detailed maps of underworld territories that provided alternative routes through dangerous regions, while identifying safe havens where souls could rest and recover from their orals. These navigational aids reflected practical exploration of the Duat's landscape by generations of regional specialists who had developed expertise in afterlife, travel through careful observation and systematic experimentation. The route descriptions included landmark identification, distance measurements, and timing information that enabled efficient navigation while minimizing exposure to unnecessary risks. Upper Egyptian traditions, particularly those centered around Elephantine and the First Cataract region, maintained strong connections to Nubian religious influences that had entered Egyptian theology through centuries of cultural exchange along the southern frontier. These traditions emphasized transformation magic and shape-shifting abilities that reflected the shamanic practices of southern neighbors while incorporating distinctly Egyptian elements such as divine anonym claw and cosmic geography. Upper Egyptian manuscripts featured extensive collections of animal transformation spells that provided access to creature forms unknown in northern Egyptian texts. The crocodile transformation spells that appeared frequently in Upper Egyptian collections reflected the region's intimate familiarity with these powerful predators that dominated the Nile's southern reaches. These formulas enabled souls to assume crocodile form for navigating aquatic regions of the Duat while gaining access to the supernatural strength and protective armor that made these creatures formidable opponents for demons and hostile spirits. The psychological preparation required for crocodile transformation involved understanding predatory instincts and territorial behaviors that differed significantly from the aerial perspectives associated with falcon form or the regenerative cycles connected to Benu bird transformation. The hippopotamus transformation represented another distinctly Upper Egyptian magical option that provided access to massive physical strength and aquatic mobility while offering protection against water-based threats throughout the underworld's numerous rivers and lakes. These spells required souls to master the complex psychology of creatures that combined herbivorous feeding habits with aggressive territorial defense, creating dual consciousness states that balance peaceful intentions with formidable defensive capabilities. The successful execution of hippopotamus transformation enabled souls to traverse dangerous waterways while intimidating potential attackers through displays of supernatural size and strength. The evolution of a Book of the Dead text through the late period brought fundamental changes that reflected Egypt's increasing exposure to foreign influences and the theological innovations that emerged from cultural contact with Persian, Greek, and other Mediterranean civilizations. The Persian conquest of 525 BC introduced new concepts of cosmic dualism and moral judgment that influenced Egyptian afterlife theology while challenging traditional assumptions about divine authority and cosmic order. Persian religious ideas about the eternal battle between good and evil found expression in modified versions of traditional spells that emphasized moral choice and personal responsibility in ways that differed from earlier Egyptian approaches. The Greek influence that intensified during the late period introduced philosophical concepts that transformed Egyptian religious literature from primarily magical instruction manuals into more sophisticated theological treatises that addressed abstract questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and divine justice. Greek philosophical terminology entered Egyptian religious texts through translation processes that required scribes to find hieroglyphic equivalents for concepts that had no direct parallels in traditional Egyptian thought. These linguistic innovations created new possibilities for theological expression, while sometimes obscuring original meanings that had been embedded in traditional formulations. The late-period innovations in spell composition addressed contemporary concerns that had not been anticipated by earlier Egyptian theologians, including the challenges of maintaining cultural identity under foreign rule and the need for magical protection against unfamiliar supernatural threats introduced by conquering peoples. New spells appeared that specifically addressed the problems of souls who had died in foreign lands or under foreign domination, providing magical solutions for afterlife challenges that reflected the changed political and cultural circumstances of late-period Egypt. The foreign deity integration that characterized late-period religious development required careful theological work that preserved essential Egyptian concepts while accommodating new divine powers that had gained importance through cultural contact. Persian deities, such as Ahuram, Mazda, and Ahriman, found places within Egyptian cosmic hierarchies through syncretistic processes that identified them with traditional Egyptian gods while acknowledging their distinctive characteristics and powers. These theological accommodations produced modified spell collections that invoked foreign deities, alongside traditional Egyptian powers, while maintaining the essential structure and purpose of afterlife magic. The Ptolemaic period adaptations that followed Alexander's conquest in 332 BC represented the most dramatic transformation in Egyptian religious literature since the original development of the Book of the Dead collections during the New Kingdom. The Greek-speaking rulers who governed Egypt for 3 centuries brought Hellenistic, philosophical and religious concepts that fundamentally altered Egyptian approaches to afterlife preparation, while creating new synthetic traditions that combined elements from both cultural systems. Ptolemaic period manuscripts featured bilingual texts that provided Greek translations alongside traditional hieroglyphic formulas, creating accessibility for the growing population of Greek-speaking residents while preserving ancient Egyptian religious knowledge. The philosophical sophistication that characterized Ptolemaic religious texts reflected the influence of Greek intellectual traditions that emphasized rational analysis and systematic theology over the more intuitive and experiential approaches that had characterized earlier Egyptian religious thought. Ptolemaic scribes produced commentaries on traditional spells that explained their theoretical foundations and cosmic significance, while providing alternative interpretations that incorporated Greek philosophical concepts such as the immortality of the soul and the relationship between material and spiritual existence. The mystery religion influences that entered Egyptian theology during the Ptolemaic period created new categories of religious experience that emphasize personal revelation and direct divine communication over the traditional Egyptian focus on magical technique and ritual performance. These influences produced modified versions of traditional spells that incorporated elements from Greek mystery cults while maintaining essential Egyptian concepts about afterlife transformation and divine judgment. The resulting synthetic traditions appealed to cosmopolitan audiences who appreciated both Egyptian magical effectiveness and Greek intellectual sophistication. The artistic innovations that accompanied Ptolemaic textual developments created new visual styles that combined traditional Egyptian iconography with Hellenistic artistic techniques and aesthetic preferences. Ptolemaic manuscripts featured realistic portraiture that depicted individual facial features and personal characteristics while maintaining the symbolic functions that connected human figures to cosmic principles. The architectural elements that appeared in judgment scenes incorporated Greek columns and decorative motifs alongside traditional Egyptian temple features, creating hybrid visual environments that reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic Egypt. The preservation of core mythological elements throughout these various transformations demonstrated the fundamental stability of Egyptian afterlife concepts. Despite centuries of foreign influence and cultural change, the essential narrative structure that guided souls from death through judgment to eternal life remained intact across all regional variations and historical periods, providing continuity that connected late-period innovations to the earliest pyramid texts while accommodating the theological and practical needs of each generation. The weighing of the heart continued to serve as the central dramatic moment of afterlife evaluation. While Osiris maintained his position as supreme judge of the dead, despite the introduction of foreign deities and modified cosmic hierarchies, the ritual purposes that motivated Book of the Dead production remained consistent throughout the various evolutionary phases as customers continued to seek magical protection for their afterlife journeys regardless of changing political circumstances or cultural influences. The fundamental human need for supernatural insurance against the uncertainties of death provided stable market demand that sustained scribble workshops through periods of political upheaval while encouraging continuous innovation in textual content and artistic presentation. The adaptability that characterized Egyptian religious literature enabled it to survive conquest, cultural change, and theological challenge, while maintaining its essential function as a guide for navigating the eternal mysteries that awaited every soul beyond the threshold of death. The adaptability that had enabled Egyptian religious literature to survive conquest and cultural transformation represented more than mere textual flexibility. It reflected the profound integration of afterlife concepts into every aspect of pharaonic civilization that made death magic inseparable from Egyptian identity itself. For over 3 millennia, the evolving traditions that culminated in the Book of the Dead shaped not only individual preparations for eternity, but also the fundamental structures of Egyptian society, law, art, and moral philosophy in ways that permeated daily life throughout the Nile Valley. The artistic legacy of death magic manifested most dramatically in the tomb paintings and relief sculptures that adorned burial chambers from the Old Kingdom through the Roman period, creating an unbroken tradition of art that preserved Egyptian religious concepts in visual form across 30 centuries of political and cultural change. The iconographic vocabulary developed for depicting afterlife scenes became the foundation for all Egyptian religious art, establishing symbolic conventions that govern the representation of gods, humans, and cosmic forces in temples, palaces, and public monuments throughout the Pharaonic era. The standardized depictions of divine figures that appeared first in pyramid text vignettes established visual formulas that remained remarkably consistent across millennia of artistic production. Osiris invariably appeared with green skin and white mummy wrappings, his crossed arms holding the crook and flail of royal authority, while his distinctive Afse crown identified him as Lord of the Underworld. Anubis maintained his black jackal head and alert, upright ears that symbolized his constant vigilance over the dead, while Thoth's ibis beak and scribble palette marked him as the cosmic record-keeper whose knowledge encompassed all truth. These iconographic conventions created a visual language that enabled Egyptians to recognize and understand religious concepts, regardless of their literacy level or social status. A farmer working in the fields could identify Osiris in a temple relief just as readily as an educated scribe reading hieroglyphic texts, because the visual symbols conveyed meaning that transcended written language while reinforcing the theological concepts preserved in magical literature. This integration of visual and textual traditions created multiple pathways for religious knowledge to reach different segments of Egyptian society. The architectural influence of afterlife concepts extended far beyond tomb construction to shape the design of temples, palaces, and even ordinary residential buildings that incorporated symbolic elements derived from underworld geography and cosmic mythology. The columned halls that characterized Egyptian temple architecture replicated the pillared spaces described in texts about the Hall of Two Truths, creating earthly environments that provided glimpses of the divine realms awaiting the deceased. The progression from outer courtyards through increasingly sacred interior spaces mirrored the soul's journey through successive regions of the Duat toward ultimate union with the gods. The orientation principles that governed Egyptian architectural planning reflected astronomical knowledge preserved in written records that connected earthly buildings to cosmic cycles and stellar movements. Temples aligned with cardinal directions enabled ritual activities to harmonize with the daily journey of solar bark, while specific orientations toward particular stars connected earthly worship to the celestial destinations that awaited transformed souls. The mathematical precision that characterized pyramid construction extended to temple planning, palace design, and urban layout in ways that created physical environments that reinforced religious concepts about cosmic order and divine authority. The decorative programs that adorned public buildings throughout Egypt incorporated mythological scenes and symbolic motifs derived directly from Book of the Dead imagery, making afterlife concepts visible components of daily urban experience. Palace walls featured depictions of the pharaoh's anticipated transformation into divine form, while temple reliefs showed the ruler participating in cosmic battles against chaos that parallel the eternal conflicts described in ancient literature. These public displays of afterlife mythology serve both decorative and educational functions, familiarizing ordinary Egyptians with religious concepts that they would encounter in their own funeral preparations. The literary influence of death magic extended throughout Egyptian culture to shape the development of wisdom literature, royal inscriptions, and popular stories that incorporated themes and narrative structures derived from afterlife texts. The moral instructions that appeared in works, such as the teaching of Petertep and the instructions of Amen-Hop, reflected ethical principles that have been developed for the negative confession, creating secular moral philosophy based on the standards required for successful passage through divine judgment. These wisdom texts democratized the moral preparation that had originally been designed for afterlife survival, making ethical guidance accessible to living Egyptians who sought to improve their earthly existence. The biographical inscriptions that adorned tomb walls and other monuments throughout. The Pharaonic period followed narrative conventions established in earlier literary works, presenting the deceased life achievements in ways that emphasized moral worthiness and divine favor. These autobiographical texts served as evidence for the divine tribunal, while providing models for proper behavior that influenced social expectations and personal aspirations among the living. The ethical standards promoted in these inscriptions shaped Egyptian concepts of successful life, while reinforcing the connection between earthly behavior and posthumous rewards. The popular stories that entertained Egyptian audiences incorporated plot elements and character types derived from afterlife mythology, creating secular literature that familiarized ordinary people with religious concepts through engaging narratives. Tales of magical transformation, divine judgment, and cosmic battles provided entertainment, while transmitting theological knowledge that prepared audiences for their own eventual encounters with death and afterlife challenges. The storytelling traditions that preserved these narratives created alternative pathways for religious education that complemented formal temple instruction and scribal training. The democratization of afterlife beliefs that had begun with the coffin texts reached its ultimate expression during the New Kingdom period, when Papyrus Book of the Dead collections became accessible to middle-class families who could afford basic magical protection for their deceased relatives. This expansion of death magic beyond royal and noble circles fundamentally altered Egyptian social structure by creating shared expectations about posthumous survival that transcended traditional class boundaries, while establishing new forms of social mobility based on moral worthiness rather than inherited status. The economic implications of widespread Book of the Dead production created entirely new industries that employed thousands of workers throughout Egypt, while generating substantial wealth for entrepreneurs who recognized the commercial potential of democratized death magic. Papyrus cultivation expanded dramatically to meet growing demand for ceremonial texts. While specialized workshops emerged in major cities to produce the various components required for complete afterlife preparation: scrolls, amulets, canopic jars, shabti figures, and other magical equipment that had once been exclusive to royal burials. The professional scribes who specialized in literary text production formed their own guilds and training institutions that preserved ancient magical knowledge while adapting traditional formulas for contemporary customers. These scribal organizations maintained quality standards and pricing structures that made basic magical protection affordable for modest families, while offering premium services for wealthy patrons who desired comprehensive afterlife insurance. The educational systems that trained scribes created new opportunities for social advancement, while preserving essential cultural knowledge across generations of political and economic change. The legal concepts that governed Egyptian society throughout the Pharaonic period reflected moral principles that had been developed for divine judgment procedures described in empirical literature. The standards of evidence, testimony, evaluation, and judicial decision-making that characterized Egyptian courts parallel the fontes described in texts about the weighing of the heart and the negative confession. Earthly judges sought to emulate the perfect justice administered by Osiris and his divine tribunal, creating legal systems that prepared citizens for the ultimate judgment they would face after death. The oath formulas used in Egyptian legal proceedings incorporated divine names and magical formulas derived from texts, creating sacred bonds that connected earthly legal obligations to cosmic principles of truth and justice. Witnesses swore by the names of afterlife deities, while invoking the same moral standards that would govern their own posthumous evaluation. These legal innovations created continuity between earthly and divine justice systems, while reinforcing social expectations about proper behavior and moral responsibility. The punishment systems employed in Egyptian criminal law reflected theological concepts about moral purification and spiritual rehabilitation that had been developed for afterlife contexts. The emphasis on confession, restitution, and moral education over purely retributive punishment created legal frameworks that sought to restore cosmic balance while preparing offenders for their eventual divine judgment. These rehabilitative approaches demonstrated Egyptian understanding of crime as moral failure that required correction rather than simple punishment. The moral philosophy that guided Egyptian ethical thinking throughout the Ptolemaic period derived directly from the standards established for successful passage through divine judgment as described in literary literature. The concept of Mahat as both cosmic principle and ethical standard provided the foundation for Egyptian moral reasoning while creating expectations about proper behavior that influence personal relationships, business practices, and social interactions. The integration of afterlife moral standards into daily ethical decision-making created a comprehensive value system that governed Egyptian behavior across all social contexts. The preservation efforts undertaken by Egyptian priests and scribes to maintain textual traditions across 3 millennia of political upheaval, foreign conquest, and cultural change represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of religious literature. The institutional structures that supported this preservation work, temple scriptorums, priestly schools, and professional scribal organizations, created redundant systems that ensured survival of essential knowledge even during periods of political chaos and social disruption. The temple libraries that housed authoritative versions, Ofari texts, served as repositories for religious knowledge, while providing reference materials for scribes working in commercial workshops throughout Egypt. These institutional collections maintained standardized spell versions that prevented textual corruption while preserving variant traditions that reflected regional preferences and historical developments. The cataloging systems developed for organizing these collections created sophisticated information management techniques that enabled efficient access to specific texts while maintaining comprehensive archives for scholarly research. The scribal training programs that preserved transmission techniques across generations of religious specialists created educational institutions that maintained continuity of knowledge despite changing political circumstances and cultural influences. Master scribes passed their expertise to carefully selected apprentices through intensive instruction that combined technical writing skills with theological knowledge and magical understanding. These educational relationships created chains of transmission that connected late-period practitioners to Old Kingdom origins while adapting ancient knowledge for contemporary applications. The coping projects that reproduced important texts during periods of political stability created multiple versions of essential documents that could survive destruction during times of conflict or social upheaval. The scribal workshops that undertook these preservation efforts employed quality control procedures that ensured accuracy while creating enough copies to meet both immediate commercial demand and long-term archival needs. These systematic reproduction efforts prevented the loss of crucial religious knowledge while making ancient texts accessible to contemporary audiences. The culmination of Egyptian death magic during the Roman period represented both the ultimate sophistication of 3 millennia of religious development and the beginning of fundamental transformation as Christianity began to influence traditional beliefs about the afterlife. The Roman conquest of 30 BC brought new administrative systems and cultural influences that challenged Egyptian religious traditions, while creating opportunities for theological innovation and synthetic development that combined ancient Egyptian concepts with emerging Christian ideas about death and resurrection. The Roman period Book of the Dead collections achieved unprecedented artistic and textual sophistication through the application of Roman manufacturing techniques and aesthetic preferences to traditional Egyptian religious content. Roman workshops produced illuminated manuscripts that featured realistic portraiture, architectural perspectives, and decorative elements that enhanced the visual impact of traditional afterlife scenes while maintaining their essential magical functions. These hybrid productions appealed to cosmopolitan audiences who appreciated both Egyptian spiritual authority and Roman artistic excellence. The theological adaptations that characterize Roman period literature reflected the influence of diverse religious traditions that had gained prominence throughout the Mediterranean world during the imperial period. Egyptian afterlife concepts encountered Greek philosophical ideas about the immortality of the soul, Roman concepts of apatewa and divine transformation, and emerging Christian beliefs about resurrection and eternal judgment. These encounters produced synthetic religious literature that preserved essential Egyptian elements, while accommodating new theological perspectives that reflected the multicultural character of Roman Egypt. The gradual transformation of Egyptian afterlife beliefs under Christian influence began during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD when Christian communities in Egypt started adapting traditionary practices to accommodate their distinctive beliefs about death and resurrection. Early Christian texts in Egypt incorporated Egyptian magical formulas and protective symbols while reinterpreting their significance according to Christian theological principles. These adaptations created transitional religious traditions that preserved ancient Egyptian spiritual technologies while directing them toward Christian salvation goals. The monastery libraries that emerged during the 4th and 5th centuries AD became repositories for Egyptian religious texts that might otherwise have been lost during the systematic suppression of traditional religious practices under Christian imperial policy. Coptic monks preserved ancient Egyptian magical knowledge while reinterpreting its significance according to Christian theological frameworks, creating hybrid traditions that maintained continuity with pharaonic religious culture while adapting to new spiritual contexts. These preservation efforts ensure that essential elements of Egyptian afterlife wisdom would survive the collapse of traditional religious institutions. The ultimate legacy of the Book of the Dead extended far beyond its original function as magical protection for deceased souls to encompass fundamental contributions to human understanding of death, morality, and spiritual transformation that influenced religious development throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The ethical principles developed for divine judgment procedures provided foundations for later religious and philosophical systems that emphasized moral responsibility and cosmic justice. The transformation magic preserved in Egyptian texts offered models for spiritual development that influenced mystery religions, philosophical schools, and mystical traditions throughout the ancient world. The preservation of Egyptian afterlife concepts in later religious traditions demonstrated the enduring appeal of spiritual technologies that promised individual survival beyond death, while maintaining connection to cosmic principles of order and justice. The Egyptian understanding of death as transformation rather than termination provided alternatives to purely materialistic worldviews, while offering hope for continued existence that transcended the limitations of earthly life. These concepts influenced the development of Christianity, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and other religious movements that sought to provide meaning and purpose for human existence within cosmic frameworks that extended beyond immediate earthly concerns. As the last hieroglyphic inscriptions were carved in the temples of Fel during the 4th century AD, the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian death magic reached its formal conclusion. Yet the spiritual insights and magical technologies preserved in the Book of the Dead had already transcended their original cultural context to become permanent contributions to human religious consciousness. The ancient Egyptian promise that properly prepared souls could achieve eternal life through moral worthiness and magical knowledge continued to inspire hope and guide spiritual practice long after the pharaoh's civilization had vanished beneath the sands of time, ensuring that the wisdom of the dead would remain forever alive in the hearts and minds of those who sought to understand the eternal mysteries that await beyond the threshold of mortality.